Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
Hello everyone, this is Jack with the Book Club from Hell, an underground insurgent cell seeking to topple the United States of America with the power of God and anime. Osama bin Laden, maybe you've heard of him, but have you ever heard from him? Not personally, of course. Since his death at the hands of SEAL Team 6 in 2011, he's been much less responsive to requests for comment outside of seance sessions. So we have a problem. For someone with such name recognition, Osama's thoughts are little read in the West. Edited by Bruce Lawrence and translated by James Howarth, today's book, Messages to the World, The Statements of Osama bin Laden, published in 2005, solves this problem, or at least makes Osama's statements easier to come across. In it are 24 public statements made by Osama bin Laden outlining his worldview, his grievances, and his reasons for waging jihad on the West, particularly on the United States of America. Born in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia in 1957, Osama was one of 53 full and half siblings of Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, a Yemeni businessman and multi-billionaire. Osama turned his back on the family business, instead opting to fight with the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 70s and 80s. He led an itinerant existence, expelled from Saudi Arabia in 1991 and moving to Sudan as a result, pursuing extremist Islamist activities there. Under pressure from the American and Saudi governments, the Sudanese government in turn pressured Osama to leave Sudan, and he obliged, flying to Afghanistan in 1996. Meanwhile, Osama founded al-Qaeda and continued to fund terrorist activities, culminating, at least in terms of media exposure, in the September 11 attacks on the United States of America. Having both grown up in a war on terror world, Levi and I wanted to find out more about the man who changed the world in such a way. We wanted to hear from him, and not from the cavalcade of counter-terrorism experts or Islamic extremists who presume to speak for him. And, in Messages to the World, the statements of Osama bin Laden, we got just that. Enjoy.
I'm sure it's difficult to... Oh, excuse me. Yeah, it's difficult to translate these sorts of
See,
things.
don't you just change the letters around? It's just that Arabic's just the same as English,
it's just
but
a different
you
script.
You replace a C with a K.
It's exactly the same, just different symbols.
Yeah. It's otherwise exactly the same.
Yeah, it's actually really more of just a written difference. If you listen to Arabic closely, except for like a slight accent, it's essentially English.
Yeah, it's like Queensland English.
I can probably understand more Arabic than I can Queenslander.
Yeah. Okay, so all right. So we do speak Arabic then. In which case we probably should read all of this in the original.
Who is more of a threat to humanity? Hardcore Islamicism, nuclear Islamicism, or the state of Queensland?
Or nuclear Queensland. Queensland goes
Nuclear
rogue,
Queensland.
acquires nukes and secedes and declares war on the rest of Australia.
Queensland can absolutely not be allowed to have nuclear weapons.
Just imagine that. Nuclear Queensland. Can you imagine how nervous Indonesia would get if on its doorstep is a nuclear-armed Queensland?
Seceding from the rest of Australia.
The People's Republic of Queensland. Yeah. No, that'd be good. Maybe if our current
What if
career
Queensland
trajectories don't work out so well, we can both become underground operatives agitating for Queensland to become nuclear armed and secede.
Yeah. Become Queensland separatists. That'd be so funny.
I've been to Queensland like
Queensland. Don't even live there.
3 or 4 times. I know it well enough, I think, to start writing propaganda materials in support of the Queensland secession.
I've been to Townsville. Townsville's beautiful. See, it's very beautiful up there. It's crazy part of Australia. Crocs in the ocean and stuff. Fucking irukandji jellyfish.
Yeah.
Stuff wants to kill you up there.
I just don't like the tropics so much, actually. Maybe that'll be part of the revolutionary doctrine to make Queensland temperate. I think that's a reasonable demand to make.
I think that's a good thing. Could we control climate change well enough to make Queensland temperate?
Well, maybe this is the wedge issue. This is
Tasmania.
You make this demand
sort of
the Australian federal government. You say to Canberra that unless you make Queensland temperate and you stop making Queensland tropical, then we will wage a violent revolutionary campaign and assassinate all federal MPs and their families unless they either stop Queensland from being tropical or they let Queensland secede with nuclear weapons. And
That
then
sounds like the most reasonable political doctrine I've ever heard.
we could the grand reveal of this political document could be on the podcast, which would be pretty good. That'd be a pretty good story arc.
We start rallying
Book Club from
Queenslanders around separatism.
Yeah.
Separatism. I just have been getting into the Network State, which might be a good book for this.
The biology
podcast,
one?
actually, by biology Srinivasan. It's interesting.
We'd need to pick the version,
but he makes
too,
these
because he
good
keeps
points.
updating it.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess like whichever's the most recent.
Yeah.
Fucking who cares? But yeah, we could just rally a whole bunch of people from around. They don't even have to be Queenslanders, but in principle, if we just use biology's network state idea, we can just get a whole bunch of people who just want Queensland to
If
secede.
you're a Queenslander in your heart.
If you're a spiritual Queenslander,
If you wear board shorts and thongs everywhere
all the time,
then you can join.
Yeah, if you've got a troopy.
If your taste buds are specifically wired that you enjoy the taste of 4X and
4X
Bundaberg
gold.
rum, then you're allowed to join the Nuclear Queensland Collective.
If you fucking froth schoolies, then
If you're 35
Even
years
though-
old and still go to the Gold Coast
and still go
every
to
December for
schoolies.
schoolies.
They call them toolies, the old people who go to schoolies, which I find pretty questionable. If you're like 30,
Oh, 30 questionable.
40,
It's
going
fucking
to schoolies,
disgusting. What are you talking about?
You're a bit of a fuckwit.
It's just gross. Fuck yeah, get to
I
party
was
with all
up
the
there the other-
17-year-olds getting trashed after high school finished.
Oh, it was so gross. I went up there to visit our friend who's locuming at the Queensland, like the Gold Coast Hospital, and it just happened to be one of the weekends that Schoolies is on, and it was fucking trash.
Schoolies is
It's just
disgusting.
trash.
I went to Schoolies when I was 18, and I thought it was
Did you?
disgusting when I was 18.
No, I didn't go to Schoolies when I was 18. Me and my friends just went to the beach for like a week down in New South Wales. We didn't go to the Queensland Schoolies.
No, I went to
I'm really
Byron
glad
Bay
we didn't.
Schoolies. It's not as disgusting as Queensland.
Oh, you are
pretty gross.
I think it's still got a pretty bad reputation, though.
I can confirm. I'm glad that social media and posting pictures of yourself on the internet wasn't quite as widespread as it is now. It was widespread, but it didn't have quite the cultural penetration that it has in 2022.
What sort of cancel-worthy shit would be coming out about you, Jack? I suppose
Well,
You're doing this
nothing that I
podcast.
will
This-
announce and
this-
publish on the internet.
this podcast, look, if this podcast doesn't get us cancelled in the future, I'd be really surprised. It's probably more of an indication that we'd failed in our goal of becoming obscure internet personalities famous for reading insane books.
Yeah, it's I think our obscurity rather than our content is what's protecting us from cancellation. That's our shield.
Is that
Our
really
reputational
protection?
shield of no one knowing who
It's just
we
that
are.
the societal immune system has not realized that there's a threat yet. It has not activated the cancel culture thought police.
It's
on
all
us
right,
yet.
even though we haven't said
But what are
our
they going to do?
surnames.
What are they going to do? Like kick us off Twitter or something? Well, firstly, they can't because now Senior Musk is at the helm.
Checkmate,
And
we barely even
secondly-
use our Twitter account.
And we don't barely. And then also, even if we did start using these sorts of things, like look at what we say.
You can't kill an account that's already dead.
And what good, as any radical Islamist would know, like you can't kill a man who is willing to die. You don't have anything to threaten a man with who's already willing to die.
That's right. I will martyr myself for this podcast and for my dream of a nuclear-armed Queensland,
And we expect
independent of the
nothing
tyranny
less
of Canberra.
from our acolytes. We need people to keep on joining our Discord. We need to start radicalizing the people on the Discord.
Oh, yeah. Well, the first part is to lure people in by making them think that it's not a violent revolutionary movement for a nuclear-armed Queensland. It's only once they're invested personally that you hit them with, oh, you want to bomb a 7-Eleven?
There must be some sort of like tactic that cults use to just sort of increase. I imagine it'd be something along the lines of like asking increasingly, like making demands or requests that the people do things, and each little step along the way is like slightly more buy-in the person needs until you get to the point where you're asking them to do like, crazy shit.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I recently asked people in the Discord for pictures of their cats. Then next, I'll probably ask for pictures of their feet.
Yeah, pictures of their dicks.
Yeah. And then eventually it's going to be,
feet.
Can you send me a picture of yourself, like, I don't know, planting a bomb underneath Parliament?
Which Parliament? We don't really care. Preferably
just
Australia.
any of them. It can be a state one, can be federal.
But any
I don't
Parliament.
give a shit. Doesn't have to be in
Start
Australia.
a new country, create a Parliament, and then plant a bomb under that Parliament.
You can just imagine the headlines. It's a Danish Parliament bombed by Queensland separatist demanding nuclear weapons for Queensland. Really, really piling the pressure on Anthony Albanese.
Member of what would they call us? An alt-right podcast, a radical podcast.
It's pretty hard to pick a political orientation of our podcast. We're definitely extreme. It's just unclear in which direction. We're extreme in all directions.
That's why I think we need to balance out all the white nationalism with some of those the Brothers of Islam stuff.
Yeah, I reckon the Nation of Islam would be a really good episode because they've got some absolutely wild beliefs.
And then they can't claim that we're picking on white people.
I'd really like,
by they I mean the mainstream media.
For a Nation of Islam episode, I'd really like to have someone on the show who is a Muslim, and we can play a game, like a fun game that everyone likes, called Haram or Not Haram. Like, which parts of the Nation of Islam's beliefs are just flat out un-Islamic and not allowed according to real Islam? We need to find someone who listens to the show who's also a Muslim who can tell us which parts of the Nation of Islam are just completely haram.
Do you think there's any Muslims listening to the show? I wonder if there's any Muslims listening to the show.
If there are Muslims listening, let us know in the Discord, because that actually would be really helpful for a Nation of Islam episode, for someone who knows what the fuck they're talking about when it comes to Islam, to tell us what's going on. I mean, granted, we're doing an episode right now about Islamic extremism, and that sort of knowledge would have also come in handy, but whatever.
Seems as though the majority of our traffic is coming from the US, which is a real shame because they're imperialist pigs and should really be condemned. Do we have any Arabic countries?
I rank countries based on how many of their citizens listen to our podcast, and so I would have to say the US is my favourite country in the world at the moment.
So let me see.
So who's listening in the Middle East, actually? Because a lot of this episode, and we will eventually start talking about Islamic extremism rather than Queensland extremism. Which countries in the Middle East are listening to us? Because that'll determine which which country in the Middle East is my favourite.
Our highest ranking,
let's see,
Muslim country is Turkey.
Egypt, 5 downloads. Saudi Arabia, 21. So already we can empirically say that Saudi Arabia is ranked above Egypt. Iraq, 0. Syria, 0. Israel, 39. So Israel is currently my favourite country in the Middle East based on the number of downloads. Iran, 1 download. So I prefer Iran to Iraq because they've listened to us.
Saudi Arabia?
Saudi Arabia has 21.
0.16%.
Jordan, 21 7 downloads. So we can safely say we're not big in the Middle East. But 30. Okay, so with 39 downloads of our podcast, Israel,
but we're not nothing,
is currently my favourite country in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia,
but Palestine, 0.
Saudi Arabia is 21.
I don't believe
so
Palestine is 0.
The Saudis, if anyone in Saudi Arabia is listening and you want your country to become my favourite country in the Middle East, that's a title that ambassadors from basically every country in the world will bandy about together. It's, which of our countries does Jack prefer? It's highly prestigious.
Kuwait.
If you want me to officially announce on an episode that Saudi Arabia is my favourite country in the Middle East, then you better get listening. You're not far off. Saudi Arabia, 21 downloads. Israel, 39. So you're in striking distance. One person can make all the difference. If you just listen to all our episodes a few times, you could scream out ahead of Israel, and Saudi Arabia will be my favourite. Do it for your country.
Hey, that's pretty impressive. Saudi Arabia is beating Russia. Come on. Russia, do you reckon Putin's got it out for us? India.
But I know
Indians,
Putin listens to us.
We've got 111 downloads from India. Good on them.
Only 11 from India.
Well, I guess in proportion.
What about Pakistan?
111.
What about... zero in Pakistan. So in the India-Pakistan conflict, India has 111 downloads and Pakistan has 0. So I just support India in that. Yeah, totally support India.
What are the big Muslim countries in Southeast Asia? Philippines is it Muslim country? Indonesia's
I think Philippines is mostly Roman Catholic, isn't it? Indonesia only 12.
I think you're right about that.
Australia 830. Yeah,
is Malaysia? No, Malaysia's not a Muslim. Oh no, Malaysia's a Muslim country.
Yeah, Malaysia's Muslim majority.
I don't fucking know.
Where in the Islamic world are we biggest? Because that will also determine my favourite Muslim country. 12, 11... Saudi Arabia, actually...
I'm pretty sure it's Saudi Arabia.
Okay, so Saudi Arabia is my favourite Muslim country, but my favourite...
Turkey, 80 downloads. No, Turkey is the biggest.
Oh, is Turkey even bigger?
80 downloads.
How many is Turkey?
Downloads.
Oh, 80, Turkey. I mean, compared to the US, that's not much, but... Yeah.
5,000 downloads.
In the Islamic world, bring back the Ottoman Caliphate is all I'm saying. I've always held this belief. I've held this belief for at least 15 seconds, and I believe in it very strongly. It's just Turkey's my favorite Islamic country.
I wonder why people in the United States would
probably because we speak the same language as them, or we speak a crude approximation of English. And they can understand us. They can understand our hoots and howls.
Although I guess Australia is like more in proportion to population. So
yeah, well, the Australian population's a little bit smaller than the US population.
Maybe the United Kingdom is actually punching above its weight in terms of like weighted by population.
I reckon Sweden is punching way above its weight. Sweden's still...
Oh yeah, for sure. Yes.
there are
Swedes just like goofing out on this weird
there
podcast.
Are Australians, except their first language is not English. I mean, yeah, when I went to Stockholm, I felt like they spoke English better than they speak in Melbourne, but still... Like they had,
and it's less than half the population as well. That's awesome. Fucking
shout out to Sweden. So Sweden is also one of my favourite countries in the world.
My favourite country in the Middle East. Well, at least my favourite.
Sweden is your favourite country in the Middle East.
And my favourite majority Muslim country.
All right. How about some Islamic extremism?
Yeah, speaking of Islamic extremism, boy, have we got a show for you tonight, folks. We have got the king, one of the OGs of Islamic extremism. Your man, OBL. Your boy, OBL. How much did you know about Osama before reading this book?
OBL 1 Kenobi. Osama bin Kenobi.
Osama bin Kenobi.
It's going to be so hard not to make really bad 9/11 jokes this episode. If I make it through this episode without making one, I'll actually be quite proud of myself. In one episode, we will torpedo our numbers in America when they just don't want to listen to us anymore from our Osama comments. So I remember...
yes.
So we are millennials, and we're no longer the youngest generation. We're the eldest statesmen.
We're no longer cool. We're
on the way perennially online
to become basically boomers.
Yeah, exactly. I just sit on my front lawn with a shotgun, screaming at anyone under the age of 50 to get off my lawn. Scream at them to get off their phones and live a real life. In my day.
The real world.
In the black and white toned world of the early 90s when I was born.
I remember when Technicolor TV was invented.
I remember electricity coming in, but that's just because we live in Australia. Everything comes late to Australia. When I moved to Europe, I was just amazed. You know, they have these things here. I think they're getting released next year in Australia called shoes.
Holy shit.
Fucking wild. You put them on your feet, right? And you don't touch the ground.
What?
Yeah, I know. I think it's releasing in Australia next year or the year after.
I don't know if they'll be allowed in Australia.
Yeah, things do come out late in Australia.
Well, as we know, Australia doesn't even exist, so we can say
I'm a paid
actor.
About
no
one's seen my... Oh, actually, no, they have seen our faces on YouTube, but those are AI-generated faces, and we're actors.
Deep fakes. Actors.
I'm just really good at putting on accents.
Yeah.
And when I say putting on accents, I mean the one accent that I always speak with. I'm such a deep cover agent / actor that I truly think that my name is Jack and I'm from Australia, and it's causing intense psychological trauma. I can't sleep anymore because I always have visions of my past life before I was psychologically conditioned to play the part of an Australian.
It's like one of those sleeper agents.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll hear a tone over the radio or something and just flick into Terminator mode and kill everyone around me. Anyway, what were we talking? Oh, we were talking about Osama bin Laden. So I remember 9/11. I would have been like 9 or 10.
Do you remember exactly where you were when you found out about 9/11?
Yeah, I remember walking downstairs and seeing my mum watching it on TV and not real. And I remember her and Dad being really distressed. And I remember not really getting it initially until they told me what happened. One thing I definitely do remember was because I was born in the US and spent the first few years of my life there. And at that stage of my life, I still identified as, if not totally American, then quite American. I had an American accent for quite a while. I was really scared that Osama bin Laden would find me because I was American, and so I was wanting Mum and Dad to like hide my passport and stuff like that. I was like, well, what if he finds out that Jack in Melbourne is American?
Top target of Osama bin Laden, Jack, little Jack, eight-year-old Jack in Melbourne.
Yeah, so I do remember it happening, and then I was too young to really appreciate the significance of moving into Iraq and Afghanistan, because Australia is part of the ANZUS Treaty with the United States and New Zealand. So Australia goes into America's wars in the hope that if Australia ever gets into trouble, America will come to our rescue.
Yeah, we'll see about that.
We'll see. It's why Queensland needs a lot of big, beautiful nukes.
That's why we need our own nukes.
Australia. We've discussed over dinner several times, half jokingly and half not, that we should form the Australian nuke party.
I just honestly don't trust that America would actually come to our aid if some shit started popping off with China.
Yeah, I'd be pretty nervous. Fortunately, though, it's like Canberra is roughly as far away from Beijing as Warsaw.
Good thing that we've got ScoMo to shirt front the shit out of Xi Jinping.
No, that was Tony Abbott.
ScoMo, it was too.
A beta puss boy soy drinker, not like big bopper.
We just need Tony Abbott back, really. Then, don't we?
Oh, King Tony. I'd say I frequently disagree with Tony Abbott politically, but as a person, I really enjoy him. He's a never-ending quote machine. I'm going to shirt front Vladimir Putin. And I do think one of the greatest political slogans ever was, "Stop the boats, stop the waste. This government is a bad government." And that is... Anyway, we're making jokes that most of our audience won't understand. But yeah, anyway, Tony Abbott should be made dictator of Australia. Queensland should secede and be given nuclear weapons. And we were talking about Osama bin Laden before we got sidetracked again. What were your experiences of Osama before this?
Good question. So
how steeped in the Osama-verse were you?
I was very deep. In fact, I've already been to Syria 3 or 4 times.
Oh, nice.
Once just to
ISIS?
have a look around, twice to. Yeah, I was para-ISIS. I was like not fully on board with them. I did want to kill some infidels though. So I just just went over.
You're one of those
did a
ISIS
couple of
hipsters,
skirmishes.
because ISIS got pretty mainstream after a
bit
while.
of a blow-in,
The mainstream,
I was looking for the
mainstream
next.
media
It's like
got hold of them.
hipsters who are
about
constantly
finding
looking
those-
for the next band coming up.
Yeah, it's about finding that next Islamic extremist group who's up and coming. They're still in touch with their fans. They're still putting out really good music. I mean, good jihad. And you want to be on the ground floor with those. Tickets to their concerts aren't as expensive before they get big. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's what we want. Yeah, so I was. I remember being in the lounge room at home in Sydney, my obviously parents' place when I was 7, 8. And it was only a couple of days after my birthday. I'm born in September. And it was on the telly. And we were worried because one of Mum's friends was in New York at the time. So obviously worried for her. And yeah, just it being a big deal. Although I don't know if like a 7 or 8 year old can really comprehend those sorts of things. One of my siblings is Muslim. Might actually talk to her about it at some point. Oh, it's not really big. It's not really a big thing, to be honest. I do have sympathy for it though. But I don't know why. For some reason, I get the religious sensation out of other aspects of life, but I don't necessarily attribute it to a doctrine of any particular. For example, I recently watched the 1991 Christmas lectures. So every year, the British Royal Society puts on these Christmas lectures. I don't know if they still do it, but I'm pretty sure they do. They were started by Faraday, was it, or someone like that, like 170 years ago, and they've been doing it ever since. And there's these great ones from 91 with Dawkins, and he's explaining at a high level sort of neo-Darwinism, essentially, replicators and sort of game theory of it, and had all these interesting animals and stuff. And just thinking about the sheer ancientness of the universe and how, like, the billions of years life has been evolving, and the deep mysteries are still, like, we still really don't understand how, like, information can cause physical, inanimate physical atoms to, like, configure themselves into living organisms and all this sort of stuff. Like, I find I get essentially what I think of as, like, some sort of a religious sensation out of those sorts of things, or cosmology or whatever, but I just don't attribute anything, I suppose, like, supernatural to it or whatever. And I certainly do not take Dawkins as, like, or anybody else for that matter, as, like, a source of authority on how to live one's life or anything like that.
You don't have posters of him on your wall above your katana collection? An anime body pillow?
Every night I go, I've got a big face of Dawkins, like, on my ceiling.
Gigantic face of Dawkins.
Looking over my bed.
Wall-sized face of Richard Dawkins.
Oh, so when I go to sleep at night, I just look up at Dawkins. I pray to Dawkins.
All pixelated from being resized. You went to Officeworks with, like, a tiny 300 by 300 pixel image of his face, and like, yeah, mate, can you blow this up to make it like a 12-meter poster for me?
It's not just Dawkins. It's actually an artist re-rendering of Mount Rushmore with Dawkins, Hitchens, Harris, and I don't really like
Sam Harris,
I don't really like Dan Dennis very much, so I replace him with David Deutsch. But other than that, it's the Four Horsemen.
I just have 4 faces of Osama bin Laden as my Mount Rushmore. Just Osama, 4 times the Osama.
Just one so. But you know what the interesting thing is, can only assume that it depends on which part of Islam, but I assume that he probably wouldn't want himself depicted pictographically.
That would probably be idolatrous.
Yeah.
I think it would definitely be idolatrous. But you know what, Osama? I still pray to you every night, and you can't stop me from doing it.
Yeah, take that. OBL. So
take that, OBL. I'll dedicate my life to worshipping you, and it will be idolatrous, and there's nothing you can do
idolatry.
about it.
take his name. Like I interpreted all your writings as a call to convert to Osamaism.
To Osamaism? Yeah, exactly. That's the revenge we'll take. By dedicating our lives to Osama.
What I found interesting about him was his, amongst the many interesting things about the dude, is his family background is pretty crazy.
Yeah, it's wild.
His father was worth like $5 billion or something when he died from, I believe, a construction company, if that's correct.
Yeah, his father, I think, was from Yemen and born very poor and founded a construction company in Saudi Arabia and started getting those sweet, sweet government contracts and became really wealthy and had
like
a shitload of children. I forget how many siblings Osama, or Ozzy to his friends, Ozzy bin Laden, how many siblings Ozzy had, but he had a lot of them.
55
and his mum,
children to 20 different women.
It's what a shark.
That is a fertile man.
Just pumping out babies. That is one fertile dude. Yeah. But Osama's
54
mum
children, 20 or more different women.
wasn't one of the favoured wives. So he kicked her to the curb, as all Sigma males must. And I think she went back to Yemen. I think Osama spent quite a bit of time in Yemen and always felt a real affinity for the place. Yeah, Osama was well educated. He'd seen the West up close. I think he went to Oxford for a few months on exchange or some shit like that, and was apparently repulsed by the women in England at their loose morals. He was disgusted, and he just went MGTOW, and they're not totally MGTOW, but
I loved it back in the day when fitness YouTubers started going MGTOW. It's fucking hilarious.
Do you reckon if Osama were a little bit younger, if he were our age or younger, or like Gen Z, Osama bin Laden, if instead of becoming an Islamic extremist, he would have just become a fitness YouTuber and started making videos about like 5 crazy ways to increase your bench press, and then like videos about edging sperm retention and ignoring women?
It turns out there's actually like an archive where
would
Osama
that have
actually
been better or worse than 9/11?
Would have been worse.
Do we need another fitness YouTuber in the world? Would it have been better if Osama just stayed a radical Islamist?
He would have caused more damage if he'd become a fitness YouTuber.
Yeah, I think if Osama bin Laden became Andrew Tate, or another Andrew Tate,
there's a good Muslim man taking down the West.
Andrew Tate's converted to Islam. Maybe there'll be some sort of convergent evolution between fitness YouTubers / alpha male internet personalities and Islamic extremists. Maybe Andrew Tate's just going to get more and more extreme, and next thing you know, he's going to be posting videos of him from Tora Bora talking about destroying the West. Andrew Tate becomes the next Osama bin Laden. the Tatean jihad.
He's got the rhetoric for it. He's a little bit more, he might not be all about the defensive war. He might be on the offensive with that one. Andrew Tate might be a bit more aggressive than Osama.
Yeah, maybe. Andrew Tate probably could bring a fresh spin to extremist Islam.
Turns out he's just running a get-rich-quick scheme through Islam. Just
he'd be a great fundraiser. I'll give him
affiliation
that.
scam. Have you heard of those affiliation scams? We just get in like real tight to a community, like say joining a church or whatever, and they just scam the people, and you're kind of like abusing their, I suppose, their bond through faith. That might be what Tate's running. Might be. I'm not going to lever any accusations. He's a fine, upstanding young person.
The Muslim community. Andrew Tate starts leeching off the Ummah. He's identified the Ummah as his next mark. Good fucking luck. I mean, that's... I wouldn't fuck with it, but look, if that's his plan...
dangling balls. Should perform an affiliation scam on the Saudi royal family.
They'll probably just Khashoggi him. He'll find himself chopped up into pieces and stuffed into a suitcase. The nearest Saudi embassy. I mean, not that I'm implicating my personal friend Mohammed bin Salman in that. He asked me not to, personally, when we talked last night on the phone.
So should we go through some of the things that we learnt about?
Yeah.
So we're 49 minutes in. So on the book readers, dear listeners and readers, the way that we're going to structure this episode,
should we introduce the book that we read? Because I don't think we've introduced what we actually read for this episode.
We have read the book Messages to the World, The Statements of Osama bin Laden, edited and introduced by Bruce Lawrence and translated by James Howarth. Howarth?
Yeah, something like that.
Howarth.
One of those.
Published in 2005, I believe. So Osama bin Laden died in 2011. So it's he was born in the 70s. So was he born in or was he actually no? He was born. He must have been born earlier than that. What the fuck, Levi? Come on. He went to university in the 70s, so he must have been born in the late 50s. Hey.
Oh shit, he's probably a similar age to my dad. Well, not a similar age because he's dead, but would have been a similar
57,
age.
57. So it's definitely his later life stuff, but it's maybe there could have been things that he wrote closer to his death.
Yeah, so all those people who talk about how you can only make a difference when you're young, look at Osama.
Yeah, he didn't peak until
he just got bigger and bigger. He just kept...
He was 40, 57.
I was going to say he kept blowing up and then thought maybe I wouldn't say it, but I said it anyway.
Should have. 44. So he was 44 when he...
Osama just kept getting bigger. It's never too late to change the world.
I'd say he was kind of a middling sort of C-list terrorist celebrity, but he really exploded onto the scene in 2001.
It is interesting with Osama. So a really formative moment in his life was traveling to Afghanistan to fight against the Soviets there. So the Soviets, when did they invade Afghanistan? Sometime in the 70s.
So late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah. And they were there for a really long time. I think they were there for almost a decade.
They were fucking stuff up. Yeah.
And it was a disaster. More or less the same thing happened as when the United States and its allies went into Afghanistan, how they just got bogged down in a long, grinding, asymmetrical war. And with the Soviets, it was... The Mujahideen were at least one of the Islamic fighting forces fighting against them in a guerrilla campaign. And Osama bin Laden travelled from Saudi Arabia to Afghanistan to fight in that when he was quite young. And he credits it as a very formative experience. And it's really interesting looking at the different accounts of what he did there. So if you listen to Osama's account of his time there, he was instrumental in driving out the Soviets. So he borderline claims credit for the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is questionable, I will say, charitably. But if you listen to other sources, people say that he did bring in money because he had access to quite a bit of money from his family's wealth. But in terms of organization and fighting, he was never that important. So what actually happened there, I don't know. And the waters are very muddy, so it's hard to say exactly how important he was. Most likely, he was not as useless as his detractors make him out to be, and he was not as pivotal as he makes himself out to be. But the experience made a huge impact on him.
He basically, so the war started in 79, and he was at university in 78. In Riyadh, I think he was in Riyadh, and then he joined the war in like 1980. Like as soon as he finished university, he went to the war, and he was very strongly influenced by some like pretty hardcore sort of clerics and Islamic intellectuals who I suppose we would regard them as probably radicals. I don't know if they are regarded as radicals by other people in the Islamic world in the 1980s. But
we should add that neither of us know what the fuck we're talking about when it comes to Islam. So to people who know about Islam, names like Ibn Taymiyyah, who is one of Osama bin Laden's favourite scholars, and I think Ibn Taymiyyah was quite influential on Wahhabism, but I'm not positive. Like those names will probably mean a lot to Muslims, particularly ones who are quite interested in their faith. But to me, it didn't mean a great deal.
Abdullah Azam, Muhammad Qutb. I don't know how to say these words. My apologies for fucking everything up. I'm going to fuck up the pronunciation of a lot of things on this episode. I'm just going to go ahead and apologize.
We're going to really butcher some names.
Muhammad Qutb. It's Qutb. I don't know how to pronounce a word like that. I'm just going to say Qutb. Yeah. So who else? What are some other names that I can fuck up? I've always wondered about how to pronounce Al Qaeda properly. Is it Al Qaeda? Qaeda? I don't know.
I think saying it with as broad an American accent as possible is what Al Qaeda operatives like.
Al Qaeda.
Who else? Yeah, I think it's just gonna fuck up a whole bunch of words and stuff. My apologies in advance. I'm a filthy fucking infidel Westerner, and
I
my
repent.
tongue has been sullied. Yeah. So, long story short, kid from a very interesting background, but I believe he was actually successful in his own right to some degree as a business person. No, or did he just inherit just so? I feel like I read in here somewhere that he actually, after the war, he went and did some legit business and did all right for himself. That's partially how he was able to finance stuff later in his life.
Yeah, I heard the problem is that his family's finances are quite opaque, and then there's Osama bin Laden is the subject of a huge propaganda war, obviously by Western powers led by the United States against him to try to discredit him and make him look terrible. And then by Osama himself and his supporters to try to make him look very competent. So it's hard to say what's true and what isn't, whether he was a savvy businessman who, while inheriting money, also made money through his own.
But the other issue is that his brother actually went. I think his brother either took over his father's business when he died, or just started his own business. At least one of his other brothers were like really fucking like loaded, instead like actually continued.
Yeah, he's got a few of them.
Yeah, so who knows how the fuck he got his money really?
Oh, here we go. So here's a quote, a footnote from the chapter From Somalia to Afghanistan. The Saudi bin Laden group, SBG, is run by one of bin Laden's brothers, Bakr, B-A-K-R, I don't know how you pronounce that. Bakr, who is the chairman. Other top jobs.
Can you
in the
say
company
it in the most Disney Arabic way that you can, like Mustafa? Can you just be a Western pig, Jack? Come on, you know you want to.
I'll just pronounce it the Czech way because to me there are two languages. There's English, which is the normal language, and Czech, which is foreign. So Bakr, who is the chairman. The other top jobs in the company are also held by brothers. By the mid-1990s, the estimated worth of the bin Laden group of companies was $5 billion. SBG employed 37,000 people in 1999. Construction projects undertaken by SBG include the construction of a new suburb of Cairo, a Hyatt hotel in Amman, Jordan, a mosque in Kuala Lumpur, and a $150 million base for more than 4,000 US servicemen in Saudi Arabia. Its other ventures include distribution of products, including Snapple drinks. It is licensed by Disney to produce Arabic books based on its animated features, and it continues to maintain and renovate the holy mosques of Mecca and Medina, expanding their capacity to 1 million worshippers each. Okay, that last point is...
Fuck, that's a shitload of money.
...is big.
Yeah, they were like...
culturally very significant.
Tight with the Saudi
so the bin Laden
family
is huge, wealthy, and powerful. Osama is its best-known member, which I'm sure other members of the bin Laden family are really happy about. It's a... Thanks, mate. Thanks
Yeah, it's
for
like
keeping the family
we've toiled
name
for
looking
50 to 60 years from, Yemen immigrants to becoming this powerful, wealthy family, and fucking one of us just goes AWOL and starts blowing shit up.
So every family has some members who are
Black
sheep, let's say.
Like people who
Kindly.
go and start podcasts about obscure literature and weird ideas.
Yeah, but starting podcasts about obscure literature and masterminding 9/11 are just different orders of magnitude on the black sheep scale.
I would say that we're doing a better job at converting infidels to Islam than Osama bin Laden. So,
Yeah, to restoring the primacy of Turkey in the Islamic world, given that Turkey is my favorite Muslim majority country. Bring back the Ottomans is all I'm saying.
We need a caliphate.
Except for in Israel, because that's my favorite country in the Middle East. It is the Jack view of geopolitics,
is
which
entirely
is
based on
the only
listeners
objective way to
of this
view
podcast.
world affairs, I should add. So what next? One thing about Osama that becomes very clear very early on in reading his writings is his religiosity. So I remember hearing quite a bit about Osama bin Laden that he had all of these ulterior motives for why he was waging war on groups within the Middle East whom he felt weren't sufficiently Islamic, but also on the West. And these motives were money, power, things like that. But something that becomes very apparent straight away from reading him and is a consistent theme is his religiosity. And I'll take his word for it. My impression from all of this is that he was extremely religious, and his religion was a prime, if not the primary motivator in basically everything he did.
He had extremely consistent messaging.
He had very good message discipline, which makes for quite a boring read because it was 400 pages of him just saying the same stuff.
Yeah, not particularly interesting.
Yeah, I guess he'd regard it as a good thing. I was going to say he didn't really change his views throughout his life. Like, the Osama you got early on was the Osama you got just before SEAL Team 6 blew him away.
I would say that there's even part of the book where he says, like, sticking to your principles is just like one of the core things. That's what he did.
Well, he talks about how he quotes a few Islamic scholars saying that innovation is a bad thing.
Probably wouldn't like this podcast very much.
No, he probably wouldn't
go out on a limb there and assume that he wouldn't like it very much, Jack.
I think he's a big fan. He, not would be. I think he is a big fan. He's staring down at us
heaven.
From heaven. He's surrounded by his 72
He's only got
virgins,
70 of his 72 virgins.
He's torturing them by making them listen
Jack.
to our episodes on repeat. He just pulls one of his favourite virgins over. He's like, hey, baby, you want to listen to that episode on Juan Posadas again? And she's like, fuck no, Osama, please stop. I've heard it 60 times. You're killing me.
Is this heaven or is this hell? I'm being made to listen to
it's heaven for Osama
Jack
because
and Levi.
he gets to have sex with 72 virgins daily and listen to Book Club from Hell. But for all of the virgins that he subjects to Book Club from Hell on a continuous basis, in a place where there is no time, there is no need for sleep, there is only a continuous present accompanied by our two voices forever. And he's just hanging out for the next episode, sending me messages in my dreams, like, oh, Jack, when's the next episode dropping? What'd you just record? And in my dreams to dream Osama, I have to say, calm down, it's all right. It's coming out soon. We're recording an episode on you, actually. And anyway, I won't go too deeply into my spiritual connection with Osama.
What do you reckon of Osama in the sincerity front?
I think he was very sincere in his hatred of the West and his desire to pursue jihad, and I think he was sincerely very religious.
Yeah, he seems incredibly sincere, living in a cave somewhere in northern Afghanistan, like fighting his religious war.
Yeah, to the point where he doesn't seem able actually to understand viewpoints that are not religious. How he repeatedly calls the US, or Western forces in general, but specifically US troops, as he calls them crusaders.
Yeah.
And he seems to think that they're motivated in large part by their Christianity, which motivates them to destroy Islam.
Yeah, he really only sees the world through religion. It's almost it's like his mind is caught by some sort of like virus that doesn't allow him to see any other motivation behind things.
Yeah, he's certainly. It is no revelation for me to say that Osama bin Laden was an extremist. He has an extremely blinkered view of the world. I would say almost all the time he regards the clash between the West and, he says, between the West and the Ummah, as the Ummah, if we haven't explained it already, is the global community of Muslims. He identifies the Ummah with his fight, which is part of his propaganda method, and I'd like to talk about how he operates as a propagandist later. But most of the time he talks about the West's involvement in the Middle East as a crusade. Every now and then, and I think this is probably more for propaganda reasons than his sincere belief, he'll talk about how the West is purely motivated by money and have no God, which does contradict many of his other statements about how they're only motivated by either their Christian hatred of Muslims or by the fact that they are manipulated by Jews who hate Muslims for religious reasons. But for the most part, he only views things religiously. He's even got this quote where he's talking about how everything can be understood in the context of Islam. And in this case, international relations. It's from the text From Somalia to Afghanistan from March 1997, when he's being asked basically about how he would govern a country, because he talks so much about how terrible the leaders of countries are and how they need to change. And he says, "We are an ummah and have a long history. With the grace of God, we are now in the 15th century of this great religion, whose complete and comprehensive methodology has clarified the dealing between one individual and another, the duties of the believer towards God, and the relationship between the Muslim country and other countries in times of peace and war. If we look back at our history, we will find there were many types of dealings between the Muslim nation and other nations in peacetime and wartime, including treaties and matters to do with commerce. So, it is not a new thing that we need to create. Rather, it already exists." Now, in this case, the thing that already exists is a foreign policy for the state that Osama bin Laden would hypothetically be leading, or what he would like that state to do were he not to be leading it. So everything for him can be understood within the context of Islam.
Yeah, he managed not to say anything.
Yeah, basically he said, we have all of the answers already and they're so self-evident that I don't need to tell you what they are. He does this a lot, actually. He's a master of not answering questions.
Yeah, they're questions that he doesn't want to answer.
And that was one of the things that irritated me about a lot of the book, is he'll be asked a question in an interview and he just gives the same answer, which is America is really bad and Islam is really good. And that's basically the answer to every question, except every now and then when he forgets message discipline and accidentally answers the question.
Yeah, he walks into every interaction that he has with, like, this is the thing that I'm going to say and I'm not going to, like, deviate from that course. So a lot of, unless a question just happened to, like, fall into his crosshairs in a way that he liked, and where you could see he was, like, answering the question directly, a lot of the other questions he just, like, dodges or trying. And there was only one part of the book where, like, one of the Al Jazeera reporters, like, basically tried to wrangle him into actually answering his questions.
Yeah. I found it I found another quote where he's talking about how you only need to view things through religion. It's from the text Resist the New Rome from January 4th, 2004, where he says, "To remove any ambiguity, things have to be called by their true names and described by their religious terms." In his mind, something being described religiously is how you get at truth. That there just isn't anything more important than religion in his eyes. And
he's pretty much like
I was going to say it
Jordan
goes without
Peterson.
saying, but if you haven't read Osama bin Laden, maybe it does go with saying that throughout all of his texts, he's just constantly saying, praise be to God, gee, isn't God great? I really like Muhammad. It's just continuous.
And apparently the translators extracted a lot of that stuff out because it was too much. But there's still a fair bit in there. It's like, there's often these taglines that after you say like Allah, you should say something like peace be upon him, or that sort of thing. A lot of that's been extracted for this translation.
Yeah.
And still, it's quite a bit. Could you imagine talking like that all the time? Holy fuck. She's such a, meandering. I mean, who am I? Those in glass houses, Jack, just me throwing stones at Osama for being a meandering fucking
We don't meander at all.
So one of the most important concepts that I think we should get across earlier in our conversation, even though we're already like an hour and a half in, is the concept of the Ummah. And any Muslim or Islamic listeners, please correct us if we get this wrong. But the Ummah is like the transcendent community of Muslims or of Islam itself. So, say a person in Chechnya and a person in Somalia and a person in Sudan and a person in, I don't know, Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan. They're all a part of the Ummah. So he is able to interpret basically any conflicts around the entire world that involve a Muslim country, even if the conflict is not expressly religious. He interprets it through the lens of the Ummah being attacked.
Yeah, and he very much identifies himself with the Ummah, and any of his desires he just imputes to the entire Ummah. So he doesn't do the normie peanut brain thing of looking at the Ummah and saying, okay, well, what do most of these people believe? And I will accommodate myself to those beliefs. No, he decides what he thinks. He already knows that, and he already knows that that's the right thing. And then he says, okay, well, because I think it and because I am indubitably right, this is what the entire Ummah thinks. By extension, if you don't think this, then you are not part of the Ummah and you're an apostate.
Yeah, and it plays into the other major flaw in this dude's thinking, which, what do I think of it? Well, I'll explain it first. Is he collectivizes everything. So there's no there's no sense of like, say, America being a, heterogeneous, open democracy with like lots of competing views. He just sees like, well, the US president is elected. You guys are a democracy. Therefore, you elected him. Therefore, any attack on any US civilians is warranted because you're a democracy. It's your leader. Like, you have direct accountability for electing your leader. And he also collectivizes like the Ummah. Like, he identifies with the Ummah and purports to speak on behalf of like 1.25 billion people. And yeah, he is really strange.
Spokesperson about
of 1/8 of the entire planet. So, and because of that, it like that pervasive collectivization. I really think it is one of the most dangerous mind-rotting viruses that infects humans. Is various forms of collectivization, whether it's like socialism or communism or various forms of religiosity. But in OBL's case, just this really archaic, do I use the word? Yeah, fuck it. Primitive fucking understanding of the world It just collectivizes everybody into these like massive, monolithic entities. And is that a rhetorical device he's using? I'm not sure, but it's really like profoundly, I find it boring to read people who collectivize like Osama does.
He does, but he collectivizes when it's convenient to what he wants to say. Because back to your point earlier about how he was talking about how Americans elected their leaders and their leaders attacked the Ummah, and therefore Americans are free game. And we'll get into his relationship with the US more specifically later on. But he will also, when convenient, talk about how America is a flawed democracy because it's actually controlled by Jews and wealthy people. He really does not like Jewish people, but he says, it's an imperfect democracy and Americans don't have any freedom anyway and can't choose their leaders because America's horrible.
Yeah.
And he says that when it's convenient to attack America on those grounds, but then when it's convenient to justify murdering civilians in, say, 9/11 or other terrorist attacks, suddenly then Americans have perfect control over which leaders they have and are directly responsible for all of their actions. So he collectivizes, and it's, I agree, a very lazy heuristic technique. Because that's what it is. Ultimately, it's a way of reducing complexity so that the world is a bit more intelligible. That you look at a very large group of people and say, on the whole, they have these characteristics, and I use this as sort of a shorthand to understand large groups of people without thinking as much. And it can be useful if you're trying to to think about something very quickly and not that deeply. But in constructing an entire worldview, it's pretty lazy and you start missing out a lot of stuff because it's pretty low resolution. But Osama does that when it's good for propaganda purposes or when it justifies actions that he wants to do anyway.
Which also is like a good point, or like sort of jumping off point to talk about him as a propagandist and a rhetorician. So this book claims at the beginning that he is he was somewhat respected for his piousness on the one hand, and I'm speaking like within certain parts of the Muslim world, obviously not all parts, but that he was respected not only because of his piety, but because he was also a very good speaker, essentially, speaker and writer. And people even would refer to him with, what's that word? Is it sheikh? In front, they would sometimes refer to him as Sheikh Osama bin Laden.
Sheikh bin Laden and things.
Yeah.
I'd want to spend quite a bit of time on his propaganda techniques because he does this. He spends a lot of time propagandizing for waging a religious war against the West. Actually, how about we talk about his idea of jihad and stuff like that first? Because that's what's motivating his propaganda, or what his propaganda is in
That's probably one of... I mean, this entire book was really interesting. I even, despite my criticism of it, I did find it incredibly interesting. Yeah, let's talk about jihad.
Yeah, well, I found the book... I found the very start kind of boring because he's complaining about Saudi issues, or the relationship between the Saudi royal family and the religious establishment in Saudi Arabia. But at that stage, he's still cautious and is not openly criticizing. Once he's got a few bombings and terrorist attacks under his belt, he gets more interesting. But then by the end of the book, I was really bored again because it's really repetitive. Everything he wrote was basically the same, just worded slightly differently.
So jihad.
And wage violent jihad. And he interestingly never out and out says that I am leading this or I am a leader of anything or something like that. He always talks about we in the sense of either Al-Qaeda or the Ummah, but totally identifies his desires with those of the Ummah. So anyway, we'll get to that when we get to the propaganda techniques. But basically what's motivating all of his writings is this idea of waging a defensive jihad. So jihad, as far as I understand, it means struggle, and it's some sort of struggle to a religious end or to an Islamic end. And in the case of Osama bin Laden, that struggle is violent. It is synonymous with violence. You have to violently resist Westerners or people whom he regards as apostates. And if you can't go and fight yourself, like pick up a Kalashnikov and shoot some American soldiers or blow them up in Saudi Arabia or in Africa or something like that, then you've got to contribute money to the cause, or you've got to spread the good word about jihad or something like that. And he very much regards it as a duty for all Muslims. Like you have to do it. He says, like, there are so many quotes where he's talking about how Muslims have to do it. He's in the invasion of Arabia in 1995. He says, "And we remind you of the words of God Almighty. If you do not go out and fight, God will punish you severely and put others in your place, but you cannot harm him in any way. The painful torment of which God warns those who refrain from jihad is that he will give authority to their enemies over them in this world." So he's basically saying if you don't go out and fight, then God's going to punish you by making your enemies defeat you in this world, which is also interesting from a propaganda perspective. So it somewhat reminds me of how New Age gurus work. So with Don Paris, PhD, when he was talking about how the SE5 can earn you lots of money by making your business extremely successful, he does mention that you can fuck it up by not believing strongly enough in the SE5, improving your cash flows. And if your cash flows don't improve, it's because you're screwing it up. And similarly here, what Osama is saying is that, yeah, if you believe really strongly in God, who can do everything, and you fight for God, then you're going to win, because of course you will, because God is the greatest. However, if you're currently losing a fight, it's just because you're not trying hard enough. It's your fault. It's interesting, the parallels to be drawn between Osama bin Laden and New Age gurus hawking their healing crystals.
Yeah, so another interesting thing about jihad is that it's not war is only one aspect of jihad. There's other parts of jihad which just like proselytization and personal piety in one's own, say like private life, that sort of stuff. But yeah, he obviously exclusively focuses on the warfare aspect of it. But it's important to note that, and again, if I fuck this up, any Muslims out there listening, please feel free to correct us. But there's actually two types of holy war, or ways to interpret holy war. One is a defensive way, call, and there's another word for like an offensive. And my short reading of it is basically that the offensive war can only be declared essentially by like some high sheikh, basically like the head of the caliph. Yeah, so basically like the head of Saudi Arabia. There's like two people in the world or something that can actually legitimately call for an offensive war in the way that, at least according to what I read, which is probably inaccurate, but from what I could make out. Whereas Osama, very clever, he knows enough about his the different clerical interpretations and issues that are happening within Islam. He only ever calls for jihad, and he always frames it as defensive, and even attacks on civilian targets such as 9/11. Although maybe we'll talk about 9/11 a little bit later because there's other aspects to it. But say there was some bombings in Riyadh that I don't know if he took direct response. I don't think he took direct responsibility for it, but there were civilians killed in it. And he's like, well, an eye for an eye, the US has been killing heaps of people in the Ummah. So that's still defensive, basically, because you killed us first.
Yeah.
You did it first, so therefore we can kill your civilians as well, and it's still defensive. And one last thing about the jihad stuff. I think the other reason why he went down that route is because then there was an aspect where he could decentralize the responsibility and potentially mobilize people. So potentially in his ideal world, his ideas would have gone out to Muslims, and it would have like activated individual or small groups of decentralized, distributed Islamic radicals to go and commit, say, civilian suicide bombings and that sort of stuff. Now that happened a little bit, but I'm sure if Osama had his way, it would have happened a lot more than it actually did. And the way that he got around the basically needing the authority of a caliph to declare war in this fashion was that he framed everything as defensive jihad.
Yeah. The defensiveness is also really important because it allows him to justify killing non-combatants.
Yeah.
And, well, non-combatants of who are not Muslim. Interestingly, even when he's asked directly, or not interestingly, I know exactly why he does this. When he's asked directly about Muslim civilians killed during his attacks as collateral damage, he always changes the subject. He just does not have an answer for those things. So he's quite comfortable justifying killing what he regards as Christian or Jewish civilians or non-combatants in terrorist attacks, but and he justifies that with his defensive jihad, but he never has an answer for, well, especially when you bomb things in Muslim majority countries, you're going to kill Muslim civilians. And he never has an answer for that. He always changes the subject to, oh, look, we killed some Americans. So it was at the cost of like 50 innocent Muslims, but I'm not going to talk about that.
Yeah, it's really, there's another aspect of it where his collectivization of people, like, okay, you're in the same country, 300 million Americans. It doesn't matter that it's such a large, diverse population. He says that it's all white, it's all a Christian war, and the civilians are legitimate targets because they elect their president who sends the military. So it's this low resolution analysis of the world.
Yeah, I've got a good example of a low resolution analysis of the world because he's on being. It was it's in something called The Example of Vietnam from November 12, 2001, where an interviewer asked Osama bin Laden about the Muslims who died during the 9/11 attacks, as well as women, children, non-combatants, and things like that. And you can see how he doesn't answer the question when it comes to the question of how Muslims died as well during 9/11, but also how he uses this concept of a defensive war to justify killing civilians. So he says, Islamic law says that Muslims should not stay long in the land of infidels. The targets of September 11 were not women and children. The main targets were the symbol of the United States, their economic and military power. Our Prophet Muhammad was against the killing of women and children. When he saw the body of a non-Muslim woman during a war, he asked what the reason for killing her was. If a child is older than 13 and bears arms against Muslims, killing him is permissible. The American people should remember that they pay taxes to their government and that they voted for their president. Their government makes weapons and provides them to Israel, which they use to kill Palestinian Muslims. Given that the American Congress is a committee that represents the people, the fact that it agrees with the actions of the American government proves that America, in its entirety, is responsible for the atrocities that it is committing against Muslims. So there are quite a few things here that really illustrate what Osama bin Laden was going for and a number of the flaws in his reasoning that he is saying that because the 9/11 attackers weren't intentionally killing women and children, then the deaths of those women and children are somehow justified if it's accidental. And in that case, then suppose American troops shoot a missile at or drop a bomb on some structure that they think are housing combatants and some civilians died. Does that justify that. And in the Osama-verse, I know that no, it doesn't, because America is bad. But it's something to consider. Also, it's unclear if he's intentionally misleading people or if he truly doesn't understand Western democracies, that when he claims that because certain people are elected to Congress, these representatives perfectly represent the desires of their electorate, including those Americans who do not or can't vote.
No, I think he's a smart dude. He understands.
He talks about how, okay, well, kids over 13 who take up arms against Muslims are fair game. What about kids who are over 13 but under 18? So they're not allowed to vote yet, but they're apparently taking up arms because they've voted for representatives who authorize strikes on Muslim countries. What about, say, if your local representative voted against interventions in Muslim countries? It's what you were saying before, it's low resolution. It's
surely
very
there
much,
was
to me, it seems like
one
justification
Bernie
saying he
supporter.
wanted to do anyway.
And
Now he's found a reason. He's like, I can kill women and children, because despite the fact that our Prophet Muhammad was a great guy and didn't like killing women and children, and he seems to use this as some sort of shield of saying, I too am a good guy because I say I like Muhammad. But at the same time, killing women and children's cool because we're engaged in a defensive jihad.
Yeah, and in fact, the killing of children is something that he he throws at the US and the West a lot. Which, like, fair enough, you'd be pissed about non-combatants, especially children, being killed. And I think that's fair enough. But again, like, it does not... it's not reciprocated. Like, the children that may have died in an attack like 9/11 in the US is just like, well, this is not even... I can't remember a single instance in the book where there was any shadow of, like, thinking that through on his part.
No. Well, the guy was a fanatic, definitely. It sounds pretty silly saying that about Osama bin Laden, but it is important to note that he was fanatical, and I'm not sure he would have considered these things that deeply. Another justification in terms of his defensive war that he uses for terrorism. What was I saying? Yeah, so you brought up that he talks about how the West kills children in the Middle East, therefore it's okay to kill children in the West. Or sort of. He says it's okay to kill children in the West, but it's also not okay because Islam says not to, and he doesn't do it, but if he did do it, then it'd be all right. So here's a quote from Terror for Terror from October 2001 that I think carries an interesting question about Osama's reasoning for his jihad. So he says, not all terrorism is restrained or ill-advised. There is terrorism that is ill-advised, and there is terrorism that is a good act. So, in their definition of the word, if a criminal or a thief feels that he is terrorized by the police, do we label terrorists and say do we label the police terrorists and say they terrorized the thief? No. The terrorism of the police towards the criminals is a good act, and the terrorism that is being exercised by the criminals against the true believers is wrong and ill-advised. So America and Israel practice ill-advised terrorism, and we practice good terrorism because it deters those from killing our children in Palestine and other places. So part of his justification for attacks on civilian targets is that it deters attacks on Muslim civilians, or he says it deters strikes on the Ummah. But it begs the question then, if Osama's terrorist acts had not deterred attacks on, in this case, Palestinian children, does that stop them from being legitimate? Because I think a very real case can be made, and I would make the case that Osama bin Laden's actions actually worsened military conflict between Western powers and Islamic insurgents or jihadis, which entails collateral damage. I think as a result of Osama bin Laden's actions, more Muslim civilians have been killed by Western powers than would have been otherwise. In which case, does that I wonder whether Osama bin Laden would regard that as a legitimate criticism of his methods?
I don't think he would accept any criticism as legitimate.
Yeah, I guess I walked into that one.
not taking the piss. Like, he just genuinely does. Like, there's no space in his head for an alternative to his perspective.
Yeah, because I would say of my main man Osama, he was a very, very competent organizer, and he was definitely capable of leading a group of people and specifying and carrying out aims. He was very, I would say, procedurally capable, but I would not regard him as a particularly deep thinker.
No.
Like as a very deep thinker at all. He found his thing that he liked and he stuck with it. His mind just did not change. And the only times that his mind apparently changes is when it's convenient for him. So, for example, we will get into this later because I do want to discuss whether 9/11 achieved Osama bin Laden's aims. But in the lead up to 9/11, or maybe I should say pre-Iraq war, Osama bin Laden talks about how his terrorist attacks really exist to drive Western countries, but particularly the United States, out of Saudi Arabia because he regarded it as a huge tragedy and a concerted attack on the Ummah that US troops in particular were stationed in Saudi Arabia following the Second Gulf War where they were stationed there. But I don't know the history that well. I also wasn't born at this point. And then from that point, it goes on to we are attacking Americans and the West, not only to drive them out of Saudi Arabia, but to drive them out of all Muslim lands, which interestingly, in his view, includes Al-Andalus, which most people would call Andalusia in southern Spain. It extends from that to Westerners need to cease any attacks on Muslims. So that includes, of course, any presence in the Middle East. He also says that no non-Muslims should be allowed in Muslim lands. I've got a quote I can try and dig up of him saying that. And that 9/11 seems to have initially been conceived as a way of scaring America out of the Middle East, to force America to get out of Saudi Arabia in the Middle East, to make it stop supporting Israel and things like that. But then once that, it became very obvious that that just didn't work, that in attacking the United States became more involved in the Middle East. He just suddenly changes and starts going, oh, look, I've been playing 4D chess and I've tempted the great Satan into coming into a long and drawn-out war in Iraq and Afghanistan where we can bleed them dry. So this is a very long-winded way of me saying that the few times when it seems that he has changed his mind really strike me as post hoc rationalizations of fuck-ups. Like he really fucked up what he was wanting to do with 9/11 and tries to explain away his huge mistake by saying that all along his master plan was to bring the US more deeply into the Middle East and into conflict with the Ummah.
So deeply, deeply fucking incorrect. It's ridiculous. Yeah.
It is interesting.
He was living in fucking La La Land, man. Like, it's one thing.
It reminded me of what happened with the Japanese and Pearl Harbor, actually. How apparently the strategic thinking of the Pearl Harbor attack was that from the perspective of the Japanese military and the emperor, Americans were a nation of shopkeepers who only cared about money, and if you attacked them and scared them, they'd just crumble because all they cared about were profits and were completely spineless. But as we know, the Americans just went fucking apeshit and ended up nuking Japan. And similarly, I think Osama bin Laden really misread how, it's a country of almost 340 million people. So I'm making a generalization, but on the whole, Americans, there seems to be a great deal of division in times of relative peace because they're quite external people. They tend to complain very loudly and assume that everyone wants to know their opinions on everything, which I regard as quite a nice characteristic. But when attacked, Americans tend to fall in line with each other and just go berserk and start leveling countries. And Osama bin Laden made the same mistake that Emperor Hirohito did in the lead up to America joining the Second World War, in that he made a very flashy attack on Americans, and instead of what he expected to happen, where the American will would crumble, Americans just went crazy and kicked Saddam Hussein out of power, kicked the Taliban out of power in Afghanistan in 2 months. He totally misread how Americans think. And to me, at least, it just says that he actually really did not understand the group of people he considered his enemy.
Yeah, 100%. I don't think he understood anything, really. His brain was rotted from his fanaticism.
From too much Quranic study.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things to say in regards to what you just said. Firstly, what people have got to understand about the US is, at least over the last, say, 100, maybe actually a bit more than that, because they were involved in some conflicts with Argentina and stuff before World War II and World War I. But for a very long time, those motherfuckers have been at war. They have probably been at war more than any other country in the last 100 years. They've constantly been at war. And in addition to that, they're also hyper obsessed with technology. So they've just got this double thing going for them where they're extremely wealthy, they're extremely on the cutting edge of technology, and their military is, I would argue, probably the most battle hardened military other than fucking maybe Israel. So,
yeah, but they've got a much larger population. That
counts for a huge amount, because war, like anything else, is a matter of learning, and the landscape of war is always changing with regards to technology and tactics and that sort of stuff. And they've been fucking at it, just generation after generation. Their senior military leaders have actually had battle conflict, have actually had conflict experience. I even saw this, and I'm inclined to agree with this analysis, at least along this parameter. The distinction between China and the US, if they were to go to war, it's China, what conflict experience do they have? Small amounts, but compared to the US, it's just night and day. And whilst it's hard to quantify what that's worth, I think it's probably worth a huge a huge amount of what's that golf term? Handicap. It's a huge handicap.
Yeah. So, I mean, for whatever it's worth, I think my perspective on the US is, well, it has advantages and disadvantages in that I did live there for a while. I go back fairly regularly and have quite a few friends there because I spent a fair bit of my childhood there. But I also can view it as a foreigner because I've spent most of my life in Australia. But I am pretty nervous that China will make a similar mistake that Japan in 1942 made, that Osama bin Laden in 2001 made, where they regard Americans as a group of people that, because they're extremely open with their conflicts within America, say the culture war shit, their politics and things are very external. And not only do they tend to publicize them by talking about them on social media and things, they'll make movies and TV shows and stuff like that about them. Not only do they air their dirty laundry, but they make it very entertaining to watch their dirty laundry being aired.
Yeah. They're really good at it.
But if you don't really have much of an understanding of American culture, you can interpret that as massive, insurmountable internal division. And it does seem to, as far as people can tell, because the Chinese Communist Party is very opaque, and especially now post-COVID, that most foreign journalists have been expelled from the country, even more opaque. But I do worry that there is a growing consensus among the leadership that America is weak and dissolute and doesn't have the will to fight a war. But it really is historically when you push Americans, they just flip the fuck out.
Yeah,
like in a really violent way.
They fucking love
and
their country.
that makes me worry that the Chinese leadership will miscalculate.
The other thing that they
really
miscalculate that these sorts of close societies, so like all of those people, I could say like the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, the CCP, and Osama bin Laden, because they come from closed societies.
That's exactly
closed
right.
and open in the sense that Popper discusses. They come from closed societies. They don't understand that the peaceful, if heated, discourse in the US, especially, but also other Western countries, is evidence of weakness. But it is, in fact, evidence of one of the greatest strengths, which is the error correction mechanism of free speech. So the question I ask myself is, if you had an open society where everybody had the ability to instantaneously broadcast their point of view to everybody else simultaneously, what the hell would you expect? You wouldn't expect everybody to just
it's going to look like a shit show.
It's going to be a shit show because you have hundreds of millions of people from all different backgrounds arguing about. But the flip side of that is that what would you expect from a closed society? You'd see exactly what you see in China, which is a single point of view. And as soon as any alternative points of views are expressed on any of their internet platforms, it's immediately silenced. So unity is evidence of homogeneity. And in this particular case, disunity can in fact be evidence that there's error correction going on. And these people, because my claim or my analysis is that these leaders from these other countries, because the selection mechanism for basically becoming a leader so in the kind of an analysis of like what are the characteristics that would be selected for in an organization, can you kind of infer something about the nature of the people who ascend in those organizations? Well, in the CCP, whilst they are effective at some things, one of the key things that they're selected for is like brutality, brutality and allegiance to Xi Jinping. And basically that's it. That's like those maybe there's some others, ask a China expert. But in the US, there's a bunch of different things that they're being selected for, career politicians and stuff.
How entertaining they are.
But man, there's a lot of other things being selected and especially in their military. And I don't think that other people from, like, if you're from a closed society, you just don't understand how powerful that mechanism is.
Yeah, and I guess we'll talk about this more when we get to talking about, did 9/11 achieve Osama's, or at least his stated goals, which I'd say no, it didn't. But yeah, it's a really interesting point that he was approaching this from a perspective that I think really negatively impacted his decision making, because he viewed everything as a religious conflict. And it's because the US was intervening in the Middle East because they are Christians and because they want to retake the Holy Land. And also he just, did not understand open societies. And both those things made him make major miscalculations.
And his arrogance as well. He's deeply arrogant. So
he's deeply arrogant.
He talks about it earlier in the book. Because the high level structure of the book is it's his writings or like speeches in chronological order from the 80s until the early 2000s. So earlier in the book corresponds to earlier in his career and life.
Yeah, the book was published in 2005, and I think the last of Osama's writings is from 2004, I think.
Yeah.
Or at least in
killed
this
in
book.
2011. But what was I saying? Sorry, zipped out of my head. Oh yeah, he's incredibly
Talking about his
arrogant. So he also like basically. So there's the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 80s for 10 years, and he was involved in that in Jalalabad, I think. Is that how you pronounce it?
Don't ask me. I don't speak Pashto.
Anyways, wherever he was fighting, they were assisted by who? The US or the UK? I think the US.
The CIA.
Yeah. And,
The CIA provided the Mujahideen with significant training. They gave them a bunch of Stinger missiles and shit.
And a bunch of other things. So, obviously the Mujahideen were fighting, but they weren't doing it alone. And he basically, he essentially said, in a nutshell, it was basically just the Mujahideen, and really like they were kind of just extras on the side. We fucking kicked the goddamn Soviets out. And he did not like consider at all, just like, you probably wouldn't have been able to do that if it weren't for the assistance of the West, mate.
Yeah. I've got a quote here from A Muslim Bomb in December 1998, where he says, "The Americans are lying when they claim they helped us at any point, and we challenge them to present a single shred of evidence to prove it. In fact, they were a burden on us and the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and there was no agreement between us." And this is interesting from a propaganda perspective. So it does seem that bin Laden himself was not trained by CIA operatives, and American officials deny that they had any involvement with Osama bin Laden during the Soviet war in Afghanistan. I would say on both sides there is significant incentive to deny any involvement. I mean, of course the CIA don't want to fucking admit that they trained Osama bin Laden if that ever happened. And of course Osama doesn't want to accept that the Americans played a significant role in getting the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan, in that the Americans were the ones who played the major role in weakening the Soviet Union to the point where they just could not continue prosecuting that war. But like the whole thing about we challenge them to present a single shred of evidence, it's like there's a lot of evidence that the US were involved in arming the Mujahideen, that the CIA had significant interests in Afghanistan. Like that's not secret knowledge. Those are declassified documents. It's in the public domain. But it's a rhetorical technique he frequently employs, where he says something very stridently as a challenge, like, yeah, I challenge you to provide us with evidence. And because this is not a dialogue format, it's just Osama writing something to you or sending a VHS of himself talking to Al Jazeera. I guess if you have absolutely no interest in looking into it or of fact-checking him, then it might be somewhat compelling.
And then he flips it into religiosity, which is or like piety, I should say. He's like, well, the reason why the Mujahideen were able to kick out the Soviets is because of their they were essentially blessed by God. They were fighting God's war. So
yeah.
And then he'll always inevitably selectively quote the Quran. And I really like the book because sometimes he only half quotes things from the Hadith or the Quran. And then the author will say, this is only half the quote. Here's the rest of the quote.
Yeah, and oftentimes the second half of the quote really changes the meaning. From like, oh yeah, go and kill all of your enemies because they're non-Muslims, to, if you complete the quote, it will have like a very important qualification there, which would make it a less compelling case for going and murdering people for not being Muslims.
And slightly related to that is that he's particularly not asphyxiated, fixated on No, I don't know if he was into asphyxiation. I can only assume. Although, I wouldn't put it past him. It's pretty strange.
I just
dude.
think, broadly
he
speaking,
did live in a cave with
anyone who is that interested in the sexual lives of others, as he was, given how how deeply religious he was. No one who was that interested in the sex lives of others has a normal sex life. He would have been into some weird shit. I guarantee it.
He lived
No
in a
one's that
cave in
sexually
northern
pious.
Afghanistan with a bunch of other dudes.
Yeah. It's very lonely in Tora Bora at night.
No, but, anyway, so he's fixated on a very particular, what some people would regard as radical, like let's see if I can find like one of the guys, Abdullah Azam,
Yeah.
a radical Islamic scholar and preacher of Palestinian origin. He taught that jihad was a moral obligation of Muslims and the quote-unquote sixth pillar of faith, whereas conventionally there are only 5 such pillars of faith in Islam. Azam taught in Saudi Arabia from 78 to 84, which is when bin Laden was studying, and I believe he actually studied under him. And he moved to Peshawar, where he worked in conjunction with bin Laden, setting up a recruitment center for the MAK, the Maktad al-Kidabat, which is I can't remember what it was, but it was some sort of military organization. There are some other like particular clerics and sheiks that Osama was basically like, yeah, these guys are the OGs. They know what's up. Whereas these other clerics, they've betrayed Islam. And he'll, just to sort of tie that back to the jihad thing, for example, he'll be like quoting certain scholars or certain parts to justify the jihad, or that it's okay to kill civilians because our civilians were killed first or whatever. But obviously, Islam is an extremely large, complex ideological system. There's only 2 major sects, right? Sunni and Shiite. There might be other smaller sects as well. And
there are so many smaller ones.
Enormous clerical diversity and all of this sort of stuff. He just has
they're all wrong.
They're all wrong. And in particular, he then starts, and earlier in the book, he's pissed off at the Saudi royal family and eventually just starts calling them apostates.
Yeah.
And saying like, yeah, the Saudi, the royal family and the clerics that they use to like try to authorize their actions, they're a bunch of apostate traitors who have betrayed the Ummah. So it's basically, in Osama's world, it's like, my way or the fucking highway, fellas. That's it.
Yeah, it was particularly this guy called Ibn Taymiyyah that he quotes a lot. That seems to be his favorite of these clerics. Ibn Taymiyyah. Like, Ibn Taymiyyah, more like Ibn tie me up, fuck me in the mouth. That's what I want Osama to do to me. Fuck yeah.
I don't want to look, this does not apply to all cave-dwelling peoples because I don't want to generalize that. But just with regards to Osama, he looked like a stinky motherfucker. I bet you that cave that they were sitting in smelled like shit.
Why do you think he was so angry all the time? It is interesting what you said about secular leaders, though, because he really did not like secular leaders in the Arab world, in the Middle East more broadly, and in the Muslim world even more broadly. He regarded them all as traitors. And when he was younger, he spoke about them a little bit in slightly more guarded terms because I think he was just less extreme when he was younger. But as he gets older, his attacks on local leaders get more and more and more outrageous until, as you said, by his last writings, he's just calling the entire Saudi royal family apostates, saying that they're not Muslims, saying that all of the clerics they sponsor are not Muslims and are leading people astray, calling for attacks on them, like violent overthrow of all governments in the Middle East, and blaming them for all sorts of things. So he calls them idols, and he regarded following those leaders as fundamentally idolatrous. In Resist the New Rome from January 4, 2004, he says, "Therefore the ruler became an idol to be worshipped instead of God. This is the current situation in Saudi Arabia." And as far as I can tell, the process by which rulers came to be worshipped instead of God was because rulers would impose secular legal systems in which certain things that are forbidden by Islam, say usury, drinking alcohol, stuff like that, are legal. And in doing so, the rulers are usurping God. And then if anyone follows those rulers, and by follow those rulers, in Osamaland, that means not like planting bombs under their cars or trying to shoot them and things like that. That is what entails following a ruler, not trying to kill them. Then you're effectively worshipping this ruler as an idol instead of God, and that makes you stop being a Muslim, and that makes you fair game to be killed
He uses
by
this
Osama
phrase,
and the Al-Qaeda boys.
what is it? The law of men instead of the law of God. So
Yeah.
any man-made laws is essentially just, okay, what is he's basically like a constitutional originalist to map fundamentalist Islam into the American context.
He's a Scalia of the Quran.
He's the Scalia, basically. Imagine Scalia, but Muslim blowing stuff up. That's what he's saying. And instead of the Constitution, it's the Quran. Yeah. So he only wants pure Sharia and none of this secular crap.
I do think his talents were much more as an organizer and a propagandist than a thinker, because his thinking is full of holes. But I really think it is a big part of what his talent as a propagandist was just message discipline. He just says the same thing over and over and over again, and
he also utilized the early internet really cleverly.
Yeah, he would have been
message.
posting like decapitation vids on TikTok if he were around today. Finding
Yeah,
a way
like
around
ISIS
those
was actually
filters.
following in Al-Qaeda's like footsteps, basically. Like they
Al-Qaeda warped
innovated.
so ISIS could run.
Yeah. ISIS really did fucking blow up the internet there for a while. Those live beheadings, that's crazy shit, man.
Yeah, they were pretty plugged into the attention economy.
Really, they were big fans of Gary Vee. They fucking
Viral
love Gary
content.
Vee. ISIS, Gary Vee. Like next ISIS fucking get together, they're gonna invite Gary Vee over for a
Gary Vee. Gary
he's gonna
Vee
be up there with his fucking iPhone yelling about, "You still don't get it. All the attention is on this phone." And ISIS is like, yes, that's right. We've got to move to TikTok. Trending on TikTok.
Yeah, we got to watch out for Gary Vee.
Did you hear about Liver King?
What did Liver King do?
Well, he's on steroids, right? Obviously, like
Oh yeah, fucking of course that guy
it
is. Have a
takes
look
all
at
of
him.
about
Like, 2
neurons to realize that dude's on fucking steroids.
yeah, there is no fucking way.
He's like
What was this whole thing? It's like,
old.
the 7 ancestral tenets or whatever the fuck. You do these things like sleeping and getting enough sunlight, and you're just going to become like 120 kilos of lean mass. Yeah, get fucked.
He doesn't look very tall either. I think he might be shorter than us. He doesn't look very tall. He's like fucking 100 plus kilos of like lean
He's
muscle.
so jacked.
And he's like 40.
Achievable naturally.
And he's achievable naturally. But he wasn't sorry.
I mean, as
about
we all
taking
know,
steroids.
Ronnie Coleman was natural his entire
Natty,
career. So
Natty King of the Natties, Ronnie Coleman.
if you can win the Olympia 8 times naturally, like Ronnie
You can do
natural
anything.
bodybuilder Coleman, then you could
you might
probably
even
do
be
a
able
Liver
to
King.
win the Tour de France a few times naturally.
Yeah.
See, I don't have any.
Is a bike too high tech for Liver King? I mean, look, test suspension is obviously
It's
natural
the only
enough,
sort of
but
suspension he wants near his body.
yeah.
No, so anyways, I was saying, why was I talking about the Liver King?
Liver King for jihad.
And the Liver King for jihad.
He's already got a beard.
That was somehow tangentially
He should become a jihadi.
He would fit in well in a cave in northern Afghanistan, in the mountains of northern Afghanistan.
He becomes responsible for a spate of like mass casualty spear attacks. He just lines up like a group of a bunch of ancestral spears and starts throwing them at people. like Fed Square or something like
At
that.
vegans or something. Or internet tough
No, it'd
guys.
have
He
to be
gangs up with Andrew Tate, becomes a Muslim. Wages war jihad on the West.
I just think there's a crossover potential between fitness YouTubers and extremist
Extreme
Muslims.
Islamists. Man, my mouth. Not very well practiced at saying words from another culture. But the reason why I was talking about him is you really can blow up very quickly on the internet. Like the book club from hell is just blowing up at the moment.
Like we're not doing.
Like we're not doing. No, but he aimed to have like 1 million viewers in less than a year, and he got to 1 million whatever Instagram followers or something in like 6 months or something like that. So yeah, that's all I was going to make a point of, just how quickly you can blow up on the internet. Like ISIS. Yeah. ISIS really blew up. They would take off today. I'm kind of surprised that actually, no, there hasn't been another big organization that's taken off on the internet, like that's really radical. That I've
Be
heard
the change you want to see in the world, Levi. Why don't you travel to Syria?
Was it Wall Street's Bets? They did a pretty good job. That was fucking sick what they did.
That was so much fun.
Were you involved in that at all? Oh no, maybe you're not allowed to. I don't know. You're like, no, surely everything they did was legal, right?
Yeah, they did legal stuff.
Yeah, they didn't do anything illegal. They just fucking wrecked some hedge funds. It's funny.
Citadel Capital just got absolutely reamed by a bunch of degenerates on r/Wall Street Bets buying fucking GameStop shares.
It's so funny. It's so
well,
funny.
not even the shares, because they were buying stuff on Robinhood, weren't they? So they were buying a bunch of GameStop derivatives.
Was Robinhood just derivatives?
I don't understand Robinhood's
actually
business
buying
model
shares?
Exactly, but it's something like you're not actually
That's a
buying
fucking
shares, you're buying derivatives of
That's
those
garbage.
shares that Robinhood... Yeah, that Robinhood's selling you the derivatives because it's something that I think there's just more... I don't understand. It's in some way it's easier that they just sell you a derivative instead of the shares themselves. But I mean, I'm saying this with no background in
Al-Qaeda. Do you reckon they're selling shares?
They should have made tokens. This is like Osama missed out on the blockchain.
They would have fucking made so much money.
Al-Qaeda NFTs.
Al-Qaeda's. Yeah, but no NFTs, mate. That's idolatrous, mate. Unless it's just
an NFT doesn't have to be a JPEG.
Yeah, or just
could have been something else. Yeah. JPEGs of geometrical patterns.
Do depictions of people or something. JPEGs of patterns or just smart contracts. Yes. What could they do that would be on brand for them? Defensive jihad smart contract. Yeah,
you can make a smart contract with God. So it's like if you go and like I don't know, do a suicide bombing or something. In the smart contract, so there'll have to be some sort of off-chain monitoring, like a Chainlink. Like you could probably do it through Chainlink. So
Chainlink with God.
If Chainlink detects that you've blown yourself
up, do you reckon
up
Allah is
at a Woolworths
Chainlink,
or something like that in Carlton, then your family gets a certain amount of money and you get your 72 virgins in the afterlife. I reckon, like Ethereum smart contracts for jihad would be good, or you could do it on Cardano. I don't care. Like they can do it on all sorts of chains.
They could maybe all of the big Ethereum hacks over the last 2 years, have been actually just siphoning money off to Al Qaeda. Is Al Qaeda even operational anymore? I haven't heard about them in years. They're so fucking 2010s, mate.
Yeah, I know. They've really fallen off hard. I mean,
actually,
they're sort of like
2010s. They sort of feel. I can't remember hearing about those guys for since at least 2012 or something.
I know they're like dubstep. They blew up like crazy for a while, and then they just fell off. it's just how it happens. ISIS came and ate their lunch, and then ISIS fell off too.
Huh.
Anyway,
look at that. Qatar, apparently they've been financed by the Qatari government. Allegedly. Okay, I'm not going to stand by those claims. That's not a hill I'm willing to die on. That's just a quick glance at Wikipedia, don't fucking sue me. I don't need a lawsuit with the
Who's gonna
Qatari
sue
royal
us?
family.
The Qatari government.
Because I've been critical of Al Jazeera on the Discord.
They have nothing better to do than to sue an obscure podcast.
What are they're going to take all like 6 Satoshi that I have.
Nah, do it. I mean, just imagine the exposure we'd get.
I feel sorry for these people, you know? Like I look at at the Al Qaeda website and stuff, and
They have a website.
no, sorry, like Wikipedia or where they might have a website. To probably instantly end up on a fucking government watch list. Al-Qaeda.com. They just look like they essentially, and I mean, I don't know, when are these photos from? 2012, 2097. Like essentially, okay, so I'm Australian Aboriginal, and some of my experiences growing up were like low-tech experiences. I would say like somewhat intentionally, like spending some time in the bush in like a shack, like a bush shack. And some of these fellas look like that, except then they've got an AK-47. Like remind me of like, okay, living in the bush, and then they've just got like an AK. that does not look like a good combination. Like, surely you'd want to be like, okay, we've got this this rifle that is like fairly technologically advanced. Maybe we should also investigate not living in a shack in the woods. So put
Maybe
that
it's a
higher
lifestyle
on
choice. Maybe they just like
is this
living in a
it's a
shack.
lifestyle decision?
Like the AK is the technology that they like.
I think they really like them. They've got a lot of really shitty Russian guns from the Cold War. It was like even recently I saw some African troops being mobilized, and sort of they've got like the AK is one of those OG guns that's supposed to be like really hardy and stuff, but notwithstanding that, like still, if your military is like walking around with AKs or some of these older Russian weapons or whatever, it's just like you're literally like 30 to 40 years behind the game. Like you see shit on YouTube that the Americans have.
Yeah, but they're not fighting with the power of God and anime on their side. So, like, so Osama's going to win.
I just don't understand, like, in what world do people honestly, like, in this day and age, still think that the US is, like, militarily... anyways, getting off track.
How about I bring us back with a quote? Every Muslim, from the moment they realise the distinction in their hearts, hates Americans, hates Jews, and hates Christians. This is a part of our belief and our religion. And that's from A Muslim Bomb in December 1998. I like this quote because it's just classic Osama bin Laden, where he basically says, listen, mate, if you don't hate Jews and Christians, then you're not a real Muslim. This is an integral part of Islam, that you just do not like Jews. And yeah, so much of his writing is this, where he talks about how good it is to be a Muslim, and then lists all of these stipulations that you have to fulfill to be a Muslim. And invariably they're things like, yeah, you hate Jews and Christians and you're going to go kill them as soon as you're able.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. I think you can sum up Osama bin Laden's point of view. Kill Americans and Crusaders and kick them out of Arab countries and stop attacking the Ummah. That's it in a nutshell. In fact, actually, I'd reorder that to, hey, West, stop attacking the Ummah. If you don't stop attacking us, I'm going to keep on killing your people. And that's kind of it.
Yeah, he does.
Everything else
every
is
now and then
details.
will change things up. So I'll try to find the where it was. There was a really good section where he actually changed up his approach a little bit to address the West directly. Yeah, so it's this one called To the Americans from October 2002, which is, I think if anyone's going to read anything by Osama bin Laden, read his, I think it's a transcription of a videotape, I think. It's called To the Americans from October 6th, 2002. That one's quite interesting, but it's interesting that he changes his plan of attack a little bit for this one. So normally he's addressing other Muslims and basically saying, okay, so if you want to keep being a Muslim, basically you've got to do everything that I tell you to do, which is you need to start killing Jews and Christians and Americans. You need to hate them. And that's how you're a real Muslim. But in this one addressed to Americans, he picks a few hot button issues from American politics and then tries to, like, quite insincerely use those as reasons for why America is terrible and why no one should support it and why Americans should make their government cave into all of Osama bin Laden's demands. And so, for example, he says, you are a nation that exploits women like consumer products or advertising tools, calling upon customers to purchase them. You use women to serve passengers, visitors, and strangers to increase your profit margins. You then rant that you support the liberation of women. And I just find it so delicious that Osama bin Laden, a deeply, deeply conservative Muslim man, is complaining that other people are hurting women's rights, that they're not fighting for the true cause of women's rights. He also complains about US sexual practices. He says, you are a nation that practices the trade of sex in all its forms, directly and indirectly. I'd also like to say in many US states, prostitution's illegal, but I don't think these legal technicalities are that important to my boy Osama. Giant corporations and establishments are established on this under the name of art, entertainment, tourism, and freedom, and other deceptive names that you attribute to it. And because of all this, you have been described in history as a nation that spreads the diseases that were unknown to man in the past. Go ahead and boast to the nations of man that you brought them AIDS as a satanic American invention. You hear that, Americans? AIDS is your fault because all of your fucked up sexual practices. You made HIV and gave it to the world as a satanic gift. He complains about the green causes because Osama always was a big fan of the green movement. He was always a real conservationist, very environmentally aware. He only ever used biodegradable AK rounds when he was shooting at people, biodegradable RPGs when he was blowing up Soviet tanks. Every time he killed an enemy soldier, he planted a tree to offset the carbon emissions as a result of that act.
Big fan of Tesla.
And he says, you have destroyed nature with your industrial waste and gases more than any other nation in history. Despite this, you refuse to sign the Kyoto Agreement so that you can secure the profit of your greedy companies and industries. And as I'm reading this, I just thought, nah, fucking bullshit, mate. Like, what does this cunt care about the Kyoto Protocol? Like, no fucking way he cares about that. Like, snowball's chance in hell he gives a shit about greenhouse gas emissions.
No, that was just he was trying to mount every single criticism, every single moral criticism he could come up with against the US. And again, just to point out the obvious again, his collectivization of the US, just like how many people in the US are like massive environmentalists and how large the environmentalist movement is, how influential it is even back in the early 2000s. Vice President Al Gore, like running in the early 2000s. It's garbage. Can't think very much.
With this though, with the so I get that to a certain person, his propaganda addressed to a Muslim audience might be more compelling because he'll do things like he'll quote different clerics and things like that to back him up. And this is something that I've noticed quite a few Muslim writers writing about Muslim subjects do. I'm assuming it's some sort of cultural form where you'll quote like a bunch of different scholars or clerics who are backing up your point. And so like they're constantly referencing each other it's always, in the words of
rabbinical.
this particular sheikh.
The Jewish community does it.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like citation with footnotes, except, they'll attribute it to an Islamic scholar when they're discussing matters of Islamic jurisprudence. So, like, Bin Laden will do things like that, and he'll talk about issues that are very, very relevant to someone. I don't know, if you're living in Palestine, he brings up the Israelis all the time. That'd be very, very relevant to you and probably much more compelling a result. But when he's talking to the West, it's very obvious that he doesn't understand the culture nearly as well. Because, okay, in this case, his message to the Americans from 2002, when he is bringing up the Kyoto Protocol, seriously, like really, really seriously, who does he think in America is going to be convinced by this? Like, truly, how many people are going to hear this and go, oh, I didn't like this Osama guy before, but, he cares about the environment. And, okay, let's go, jihad. I'm going to go bomb a Walmart.
This might be one of the things, pieces of evidence to support our argument that this is just propaganda and that he's just a polemicist.
I mean, he's a polemicist and a propagandist, but you still have to question you're propagandizing to whom? And in this case, like, what, you're propagandizing to people who stand barefoot on top of some oil pipeline because they don't like it. I just don't know actually who this is addressed to.
I was going to say that one interpretation of this particular passage is that whilst it's directed at the US, I think that there's a good, like, an alternative interpretation would be that this is him wanting to appear as a strong man against the US, knowing that this is still going to be consumed mostly by his original target audience anyways. So how you see sometimes, like, Putin arc up, or like some Chinese CCP like official arc up, trying to put on a show, and it's like, it's, I don't know, say at like a G20 conference or something, or like some whatever. But it's like half the reason they do that is so that they can show internally on state media, like, look, we're sticking it to the US.
Yeah, that's true.
So that's an alternative. Like, he probably could have stopped if he just wanted to talk to the US. He probably could have stopped after, like, 500,000 Iraqis died in the war, so we're still at only 1% of your kill count for 2001. But the way that he just keeps on listing off, basically in his point of view, like, moral sins, I think is probably more like, it's like, well, the people that you're criticizing don't share those morals, right? So is it really directed at them, or is it directing at the people that already listen to him?
Yeah, I think that's probably the case. Interestingly, too, in that, so he doesn't claim responsibility for 9/11 for quite a few years after 9/11. He just says that he really, really likes the 19 people who carried it out, and they're great, and they're going to heaven, but he didn't have any involvement in it.
Did he do it? Did he and Al Qaeda do it? Is the jury definitely on that one?
And he later did acknowledge that he planned it.
Yeah.
But it took a while for him to get to that point. Okay, what else does he do in terms of propaganda? He spends a lot of time talking about how cowardly and weak Americans are, which makes sense. Course. You want to make the enemy seem less scary if you're also going to try to incite people to fight against it.
A point here, which is kind of about his propaganda, but also kind of about his religious view of the world. As long-time listeners might remember, I've spoken about the distinction between natural laws and normative laws. Natural, not as in like the liberal philosophy of natural laws, but laws of nature, and how, like, there's a distinction between the two, or at least it could be argued that there's a distinction between the two. And in fact, in a lot of pre-Enlightenment thinking, normative laws and laws of nature were conflated such that you could use moral laws to the typical sort of thinking would be, we've contravened whatever normative laws, so God is punishing us. Like, for example, like expulsion from the promised land for 40 years or whatever, because of something that the tribe of Israel did, that sort of thing. So, of course, because he's such an advanced thinker, Osama bin Laden does exactly the same thing in various ways. I've got one here in particular. There were some attacks, some bombings in Riyadh that killed a bunch of people. And at the time, Saudi Arabia was going through like a bunch of issues, like inflation, youth unemployment, and stuff. And he goes on, and in this particular essay, which is Declarations of Jihad, he is criticizing the royal family and basically how the Saudi royal family, the Saudi government, was allowing the US to like occupy like station troops in Saudi Arabia. So he says, people are struggling even with the basics of life, and everyone talks frankly about economic recession, price inflation, mounting debts, prison overcrowding. Low-income government employees talk to you about their debts in the tens or hundreds of thousands of riyals, whilst complaining that the riyal's value is declining dramatically. Sound familiar in 2022? Sounds extremely familiar. Seems as though sovereigns can't be trusted with the currency, but I don't want to distract us again. With more Bitcoin. Bitcoin solves this. Domestic debts owed by the government to its citizens have reached 340 billion riyals and are rising daily due to usurious interest, let alone foreign debt. People are wondering, are we really the biggest source of oil in the world? And here's the clincher. They feel that God is bringing this torment upon them because they have not spoken out against the regime's injustice and illegitimate behavior. He's putting words in the mouth of like millions of Saudi citizens.
Yeah.
The most prominent aspects of which are its failure to rule in accordance with God's law, its depriving of legal rights to its servants, its permitting of the American occupiers into Saudi Arabia, and its arresting of righteous scholars, inheritors of the Prophet's legacy, and unjustly throwing them in prison. He's referring specifically to some clerics that he really likes being imprisoned.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to basically say the regime's like desecrated Islamic law. They've not protecting the land. They've failed in their ability to keep out the American crusaders and so forth. And he's basically saying like all this bad stuff is happening because our leadership are a bunch of apostates and are breaking Sharia.
I think I quoted earlier him saying that if Muslims don't believe strongly enough and don't fight for their faith, then God punishes them by letting them be dominated by foreigners. And this is exactly in that line, that the current secular rulers that Muslim majority states have are terrible and non-Islamic, and that's why things are bad. He has this, it's an offhand comment, and I took it to be a very, very, very backhanded comment where he talks about how, despite the fact that some former parts of the Muslim world, or parts of the Muslim world that are still parts of the Muslim world but are currently occupied by Christians, and he brings up Al-Andalus again, that part of the world is wealthier than Muslim countries, despite the fact that it's so much smaller. And this comes down to governance, and governance there being better than governance in the Middle East. So at least he sometimes has nice things to say about non-Muslim countries, although it is in the context of talking about how the un-Islamic rulers of Muslim majority countries are terrible and horrible and should be violently overthrown. In terms of his propaganda, there's this other document of his called To the Peoples of Europe from 2004 that's pretty interesting from a propaganda perspective, because this document is addressed to people in Europe, as the title might twig you to. Although what Levi, you said earlier about how it's also probably for a more domestic audience, I think holds. But basically in this document, he's telling Europeans that if they continue to support the US, then he will order a bunch of attacks in Europe. However, if they cut all ties with the US and with Israel, then he won't attack them. And he gives them this ultimatum, like it's something like, 3 months after the publication of this document. That's the amount of time that Europeans have to abide by Osama's demands. Otherwise, he will launch a bunch of attacks. And I'll read some quotes from that, which are interesting to consider from a propaganda perspective. So he tries to separate Europe from America and separate European populations from their leaders in saying, as for your leaders and their followers who persistently ignore the real problem, which is the occupation of all Palestine, and indulge in lies and deceit about our right to self-defense, they have no self-respect. They show contempt for people's blood and minds through such deceit, but it only means that your blood will continue to be shed. If one looks at the murders that are still going on in our countries and yours, an important truth becomes clear, which is that we are both suffering injustice at the hands of your leaders, who send your sons to our countries, despite their objections, to kill and be killed. So it is in the interest of both sides to stop those who shed their own people's blood, both on behalf of narrow personal benefits and on behalf of the White House gang. It is interesting for a few reasons. It is hard to take this seriously because Osama bin Laden has in the past condemned US voters as completely complicit in their leaders' actions because they voted for them, and therefore it's perfectly acceptable to kill those voters because they are in some way indistinguishable from their leaders. I'm not sure why he's described that in European democracies that same principle doesn't hold, but for convenience's sake, it seems to be different.
Yeah, there's
it
many
also
ways.
is that Osama bin Laden seems to consider half of Spain, the southern half of Spain, to rightly belong to Islam, and I expect he'd continue to be hostile whether they withdrew from the Middle East or not, as he considers Andalusia to be occupied territory since the Reconquista in 1492.
There's many ways to skin a cat, right? So it might be that he's, like people's perspectives change over time somewhat, and he's just not like retconning or anything, he's just not even acknowledging it. But some of these texts are like very distant from one another. And again, this is a compilation of writings. I didn't do any further research. Actually, maybe that's something that we should look up quickly. Is like how many of what proportion of his published texts does this represent? Like a significant amount or just a small amount? But he doesn't strike me as the sort of guy who would apologize and say like, oh yeah, I said this thing before, but I made this mistake and so my opinion's now this other thing. He seems like the sort of guy that's just like, nah, whatever. Just not even going to mention it. Just move on. It's irrelevant.
Yeah. To that, I would say, in works subsequent to the people of Europe, he then blames US voters for the policies of their governments because they voted for them. Yeah. So in this case, that's a very generous interpretation, but in this case, I don't think it holds. I think it's just Osama
throw
picking whatever
bone,
low-hanging fruit he can get his hands on.
Yeah, maybe I shouldn't try to be too generous to... Look,
the generosity is always interesting when we really stretch to try to understand what these people are saying.
Okay, one thing that I did want to talk about was, whilst we're still here, we've spoken about jihad as a defensive war. We've just spoken a bit about the Ummah, which is really interesting, and him as an orator. I'm assuming that his Arabic, his spoken and written Arabic, was commensurate with the sophistication of the translation. I'm going to assume that the translator did not embellish his writing at all. And if that is in fact the case, then it seems as though he was a really articulate person. And but judging from what he was able to do in terms of organization and stuff, like really charismatic as well.
Yeah, probably. He had a lot of children. So, yeah, he definitely fucked.
Okay, so we've got a bunch of different ones. Which one should we move on to? Some of the stuff that's a little bit more, a little bit less direct, or did you have anything else to say?
Do you want to talk about the culpability of the West?
Yeah.
Or do you want to go on to, did 9/11 achieve bin Laden's aims? And if his demands were met, would he have ceased his jihad?
Okay.
Because those are all
I'm
pretty
happy.
interesting questions.
What should we talk about? Let's talk about the second one first, which is did they achieve their aims with 9/11 and arguably other attacks? Well, there's two ways to approach that I can think of. On the one hand, there is an argument to be made that Al-Qaeda as an idea is a somewhat disorganized, intentionally, no, I'm not using that word derogatorily, intentionally disorganized, or maybe what we'd say is decentralized. And so whilst there is the core component, which is like the stuff that he was operationally involved with, there is also an idea of like inspiring what is essentially independent attacks, but that are still heavily influenced by Al-Qaeda. So there's a decentralized aspect to this mobilization and inspiration of independent factions to arise and to commence jihad. And that's on point. And with regards to that, maybe you could argue it spread the ideas a bit. But if it helped get the US and Israel out of the Middle East, fuck no, it didn't help. It absolutely did the opposite. It brought the Leviathan into his homeland.
Yeah, because as to your previous point about did it spread this idea of violent jihad against the West, well, it's jihad to what end?
Yes.
Why are you waging jihad is probably a more relevant question than are you waging it or not. And yeah, earlier in his works, it's all about it's jihad to get the West out of the Middle East. It's jihad to get Israel, well, not only out of Palestine, but Israel out of existence. And on both those counts, 9/11 just made it worse.
Do you reckon he ever woke up and looked at himself in the mirror if he had a mirror, which he might not have had? I don't know, in like a puddle of water or something in his cave. Like
selfie on his iPhone.
Yeah, he looked at himself in the mirror.
Flip that camera around.
Just thought, like,
his beard.
What have I done? You know, like sometimes when you look at yourself after you've been, well, you don't drink Jack, but I don't know, partaking in some other substance, and either the morning later, the morning after, or on the way up, you just look at yourself in the mirror and you just go, what have I done? What have I done to myself?
Under your eyes.
That was a really bad idea. Do you think he ever had one of those moments with himself? as some part of a country that he is supposed to be defending is just being carpet bombed into the ground?
Yeah, I don't know if he had. I mean, I don't know Osama. Well, I mean, I do know Osama personally, but
personally know Osama.
I don't. I don't. Yeah, I don't know how self-reflective he was as a person. From his writings, he seems profoundly unreflective.
He was really into meditation and, doing personal reflective writing,
thought journaling,
journaling and stuff. Would see a therapist every Tuesday. As a life coach.
He just binge watched Jordan Peterson videos every night.
Started making his bed, and now look at him. He's mounting global jihad.
When SEAL Team 6 broke into his compound in Pakistan, in his room, it was just full of like cum-stained Jordan Peterson body pillows.
and like David Goggins posters. He's really into American self-motivation, North American self-motivational speakers from the 2020s.
He got really into like distance running and things like that while just listening to compilations of Dave Goggins calling him a bitch.
And then fucking Goggins kicks in his doors and blast them away.
Dave Goggins was leading SEAL Team 6 when he repelled him
with
through his
Jocko
window
Willink
and shot Osama
riding
bin
behind
Laden in
him.
the head.
Jocko, I assume the entire US military is just Jocko Willink.
And Osama bin Laden never heard him coming because he had his AirPods in full blast with Dave Goggins compilations, those motivation compilations of
Fuck,
Dave
they're so
Goggins
good.
screaming
They're so
about
fucking
you
good.
being a little bitch and things like that with hardstyle blasting in the background. So Osama never heard Dave Goggins coming in for the kill.
I fucking love Dave.
Snapped his neck like a Grassini.
That's exactly what happened.
It is precisely what happened. It was Jocko Willink and Dave Goggins.
It just busted in, blow him away.
They were not stealthy at all because they were just screaming at each other about the importance of leadership and motivation and waking up at 5 a.m. every day.
And
so
they ran
every
the-
militant in a 100-kilometer radius heard them coming, but Osama didn't because he was busy doing his kettlebell workout while listening to Jordan Peterson talk about patting cats.
They ran the entire way there. Jocko and Dave Goggins
They
ran from the
there
US.
from America under the sea.
Under the sea with their shirts off, just all the way over to Pakistan. Hunted him down. Didn't even use technology, just intuited where he was. They were like honing pigeons.
They live streamed the entire thing while trying to sell you workout supplements. Actually, do both of them hawk workout
No.
supplements? That might have been slanderous.
Well, not
I'm
the
sorry.
shit that I've seen. They've got their own books, man.
Of everything I've said on this episode,
They are
that's
basically
what
what you want to be.
for.
Jack, do you know Jocko Willink and Dave Goggins are basically doing what you want to do, which is they have podcasts and social media and they just sell their books. They probably do other stuff as
Yeah,
well.
I should have become a Navy SEAL. Being a Navy
You
SEAL
should-
seems to be
you
the
could
best
start
thing
a
you can
workout
possibly
channel.
do for your podcasting career.
Jack, you could start doing running videos and stuff and talking about fasting.
I could become a Navy SEAL.
You've got heaps of health-related stuff that you could
No, I think
shell.
I'll just be a Navy SEAL.
Oh, shell. Hawk. Hawk to our fans.
It's never too late to start being a Navy SEAL. No, I mean I've listened to your advice and I've chosen to ignore it and chosen to take from it that I should become a Navy SEAL.
Good.
I'll
Very good.
sign up tomorrow.
Fantastic. Okay, so our original point was: did he fuck up? Yes, he fucked up. It backfired really, really hard. In fact, it might be one of the worst backfires in all of history, up there with Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, and arguably up there with some of the other, like the Nazis provoking. I suppose the UK. Well, I don't know. There's all sorts of stuff there that I'm probably not qualified to talk about. But nonetheless, yeah, he fucked up pretty bad.
It's very interesting, but I do think he really fucked it up. And no amount of justification after the fact that in fact he was trying to draw America into a protracted campaign in Iraq will really convince me otherwise. That just seems like cope, pure cope.
Pure copium.
That he actually had just refined copium, that he ended up actually drawing
That
America
Afghani-
more deeply into the Middle East.
That heavy Afghani pure copium from the
Pure copium
fields
that
of
Osama was
copium
just
flower.
huffing in his
That's
cave.
ancient shit, man. It will put you straight in the couch.
Yeah.
So, what was the other thing that we deferred talking about? There were two things that you offered. What was the first one? Not culpability. Culpability. Yeah, that was the first one.
If his demands were met, do you reckon he would have ceased his jihad? Because he kept saying, as soon as you
Early in his
meet
career,
my list of
yes.
demands, I will no longer be fighting this war with you.
Early in his career. Here's an interesting way to think about it. Okay, so the relationship, and this is something that I've only been finding out because of reading this book. And so again, I'm probably going to fuck this up, and the following perspective is probably going to have lots of mistakes in it. I'm just going to hedge the shit out of everything I'm about to say. But
Levi's an imam, and everything he says about Islam is correct. I want to put that out there before Levi says whatever he's about to say.
the history of a relationship, the relationship between Jewish communities and the Islamic world, is not one that's entirely characterized by hostility. In fact, there were Jewish communities living under certain caliphates in like, for example, Spain, if I remember correctly, in Spain, that like no, have I got it the wrong way around? No, I'm gonna withdraw that statement. I feel like I've got it the wrong way around. But yes, other Jewish communities living at in other parts of history and the world that have lived, in relative peace with, say, like the ruling Islamic regime. And in fact, there's parts of the Hadith and stuff that I came across that were like, oh yeah, like people of the book, so Christians, Zoroastrians, Jews, they're cool. Let them keep their religion as long as they pay taxes, basically. And the first early conflict was there was a conflict between Muhammad and the people of Medina. He'd been kicked out of Medina, if I remember correctly. And
I think he was kicked out of Mecca, wasn't he?
He was
kicked out of Mecca and fled to Medina in the Hijra.
That's right. And he goes back to Mecca to try to get Mecca. And did he reclaim it? Anyways, there was a Jewish community eventually there that betrayed him, and he had a pact with them. So a lot of the, I would argue from my brief reading, like some of the things that could be cited in early Islamic literature about that are like anti-Jew, anti-Semitic, they're pretty highly specific to the context of like the specific issues that Muhammad was having with like these specific Jewish communities. And it's not entirely clear to me that you can even justify like generalized anti-Semitism. But notwithstanding that, there's been other instances where Jewish communities have lived in relative peace with Islamic communities. And so I think the modern issue is more around like the occupation of Palestine as being viewed as illegitimate and colonial and that sort of stuff. Especially because Jerusalem is the third most sacred city after Mecca and Medina in the Islamic world, because it's where Muhammad ascended into heaven. So, yeah, this is all to say, like, it's fairly complex, but I think early in his life, you could argue that if Israel, if like basically they dissolved the state of Israel, and if the US pulled out of like Islamic countries, like, yeah, maybe he would have stopped. Firstly, that was never going to happen. Secondly, later in his life, I think he starts basically, getting more and more just straight up anti-Semitic later in the book.
Definitely. There are some very spicy quotes.
To the point where it's just like, yeah, you just got to kill all the Jews. And like maybe later in his life, there would have been nothing that, like, even if the US withdrew and that sort of stuff, he was like, no, keep on waging war. Like, we've got to wipe them out.
Yeah, I think, that's a really good framework to look at it in. That earlier in his life, maybe he would have been satisfied by the quite extreme moves of, so the US just totally withdrawing all support for Israel, withdrawing all troops or all Americans from the Middle East, because he quite early on in his writings says that non-Muslims should not be in Muslim countries.
Yeah.
But as he goes on, he's got in the text to the Americans this list of conditions. And these things basically are just a pretext for a war with the West for as long as Osama bin Laden is alive. I quote, "If you fail to respond to all these conditions, then to prepare to fight with the Ummah, the nation of monotheism, which puts complete trust on God and fears none other than him." Also, as an aside, as you can see, he's saying, if you don't do this, you won't be fighting Al-Qaeda. You'll be fighting with the Ummah, with every Muslim. So, these demands were: 1, for Americans to convert to Islam; 2, for Americans to stop their oppression, lies, immorality, and debauchery, something which is so vague that I can't see Osama bin Laden ever backing down from the West, because he'll always be able to say, oh, well, they lie, so we have to kill Westerners. 3, He calls on Americans to take an honest stance with themselves to discover that you are a nation without principles or manners, and that, to you, values and principles are something which you merely demand from others, not that which you yourself must adhere to. This is a bit of the culpability of the West. So I freely admit that the West can be highly hypocritical much of the time. However, in
dangerous.
his demands, like,
Don't
just
really
stop
wanna get
being
into a war with the
hypocritical
West.
or I will kill you, is in the context of would he stop his jihad if the West gave in to his demands? Again, this is such a vague demand that I can't see him ever backing down from it.
Mm.
His fourth demand was stop the support of Israel, end support of the Indians in Kashmir and the Russians in Chechnya, and cease support for the Manila government against Muslims in the southern Philippines. 5, I quote, "We advise you to pack your luggage and get out of our lands. We only desire this for your goodness, guidance, and righteousness, so do not force us to send you back as cargo in coffins." I've brought this up a few times, but when he talks about Muslim lands, he includes half of Spain in that. So I, again, just don't see him backing down from jihad, because he would say, oh, well, the Spanish are occupying Al-Andalus, therefore we can keep bombing the Spanish, and as long as European countries support Spain in not ceding control of Andalusia to some ambiguously defined ummah, then we will continue our jihad. 6, end support for corrupt leaders in Muslim countries. I don't know what that means. Like, no diplomatic relations with any secular leaders in Muslim countries at all. And 7, this is a very, very nice vague one. We also call you to deal with us and interact with us on the basis of mutual interests and benefits, rather than the policies of subjugation, theft, and occupation, and not to continue your policy of supporting the Jews, because this will result in more disasters for you. So particularly that first point of interacting with the Ummah on the basis of mutual interests and benefits. Again, that is so incredibly vague that I can't see bin Laden ever not waging violent jihad, even on just the basis of that point.
Yeah, I don't think he would have stopped.
No, I don't think he ever would have stopped.
Yeah, but that's to be expected. So we could move on to another topic. One of them might be playing the game of trying to look at the world from Osama's perspective. And so I spent a lot of the time thinking about, like, in which ways, like, whether I'm being too generous or whatever, thinking through, like, okay, the criticisms of the US and the West in general from Osama's perspective. And one of the things I can understand is that I think it's probably pretty fair to say that, like, the death toll on either side would be, like, much higher for, well, it depends what country it is and so forth, but say, like, Iraqis killed as a consequence of the actions of the US military, or, like, what he quotes a lot of, the economic sanctions that caused a famine in Iraq imposed by the US, which, you know, probably, like, famines over the course of the last century probably, like, accounted for a huge proportion of the deaths involved, like, as a direct consequence of political actions. So that's it. See, the problem is, even trying to be generous and take his point of view on this, is that, like, he then he uses, say, like, the number of people killed in Iraq as a justification for his own actions, and he's using one key argument, and it's the only argument that he can use to justify this, is the idea of an eye for an eye. And
yeah,
he cites Islamic clerical justifications for it, but I'm sure, like, any literary tradition, he's probably cherry picking the fuck out of it. And not only that, but, like, a lot of the world doesn't work like that. But notwithstanding that criticism, the US has got a lot of blood on its hands.
Yeah, I think his criticisms that the US and the West more generally are quite interventionist. So in the 19th
Especially
and 20th
under the
centuries,
neocons and
yeah, but
hawks.
even before that, so say in the context of Europe, or at least some European countries, and it's not like Czech Republic had extensive overseas colonies,
Yeah.
but countries like the United Kingdom, France, Italy had Libya, but a lot of European nations had empires, and those empires did extend into the Middle East. And
Yeah.
so he brings up the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, which was an understanding between the French and British governments, which would define their spheres of influence in the Middle East after the First World War, or upon the conclusion of the First World War. And this agreement redrew boundaries within the Middle East that they created created boundaries of countries that didn't really reflect the religious and ethnic makeup, or didn't create geographically delineated groups of people who felt that they had much in common beyond the fact that they had now been effectively rezoned into a country by the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And that has led to quite a bit of conflict. So OBL brings that up in terms of talking about European responsibility for misery in the Middle East. And then he talks about US responsibility for misery in the Middle East later on. And I think those criticisms are justified. So did European powers and then the US need to intervene in the Middle East? No, probably not. It depends on what you're looking at. So in the European context, given that a lot of the European colonial powers were just plundering money from their colonies to bring back home, really as funds to compete with other European nations. I guess you could say, there was a calculus within Europe that if a country didn't do it, they'd be poorer and dominated by their neighbours. From the perspective of Osama, that's not
kind
compelling.
of irrelevant if you're the country being plundered to support the colonial empire. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's their problem. Yeah,
and in the case of
as
the United States...
Sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry, go on.
Oh, well, just as, obviously I was not myself exposed to the things that happened in Australia, but as, the descendant of a community that has been colonized, it that history and stuff, fucks up communities pretty bad. So, and it's not just here in Australia, it's all over the world. And there's a lot of people with, grievances with history. However, how do I put this? I guess is what is happening, say, in the last 40 years, colonialism? I could see the argument that the stuff that happened after World War One as colonialism is the stuff that the US has been doing. Is that a form of colonialism? I'm not sure about that. Maybe it's a whole different beast.
Yeah. And then also, in saying this, I will probably, I'll alienate our 24 listeners in Saudi Arabia, but... So Osama bin Laden talks about the damage of colonialism on the Middle East, but he also conveniently forgets the fact that, for example, Egypt wasn't always Islamic. So for more of its history, Egypt has been from at least the perspective of Osama bin Laden, a pagan country.
Yeah.
Than an Islamic country.
A polytheist scum.
Yeah, well, they existed for a few millennia before Islam, but Osama bin Laden doesn't seem to regard the conquest of Egypt by Muslims as colonial, even though it was. They erased the previous culture and imposed their own. So it is a bit of people living in glass houses throwing stones. Yes, like I'm not going to defend European colonialism. I'm not going to defend the war in Iraq, which I think was stupid. But at the same time, Osama bin Laden is getting very worked up over things that the culture that he wants to be global is also responsible for perpetrating, which makes it a bit harder to take everything he says seriously.
I think this ties into the broader analysis of him as a propagandist, which is his selective use of essentially like victimhood.
Yeah.
It's extremely selection, and essentially, I mean, the guy can't think properly. His brain is completely fried by these terrible ideas, and and you know, like the in his eyes, the Ummah, and what he perceives as the Ummah, or what he designates the Ummah, and his particular interpretation of his religion's holy texts and history are irrefutable and above moral scrutiny.
Yeah,
and yet
exactly.
Everything that anybody else does can be analyzed under like the victimhood. Fuck me for fucking like throwing the victim card at fucking some fucking cave dwelling poor motherfucker who's just like fighting like US airplanes and shit. But like seriously, he does.
No, I would say he chose to live. He was from a very wealthy family. Like
he chose that life. Yeah,
the dwelling in a cave and getting shot at was his
entirely
choice. Like no one made him do this.
Yeah, that's true. That's extremely true. Because Saudi Arabia, they got fucking gold Bentleys and stuff there, man.
Yeah,
they got heaps of cool shit. So yeah, no, I withdraw that. He's just a propagandist, isn't he? So there you go.
The thing is, like an effective propagandist, he says things that are true. There's plenty of truth mixed up in what he says. Like the West has really fucked up a lot of things in the Middle East. It's just I would not say Western meddling is the sole cause of problems in the Middle East, which seems to be his contention.
And as soon as you step away from the mentality of an eye for an eye, then it's just like, well, is there some sort of ethic that can transcend that? And probably in his point of view, it'd be like, yeah, converting to Islam.
Yeah, exactly. Making everyone Muslim.
and imposing Sharia. The other interesting thing to talk about was how much of it, so proportionality, how much of a threat was Al-Qaeda and whatever other Islamist radical organizations, but Al-Qaeda against the West and the US? And was the US's response proportional?
I think the US's, and by extension the Western world's response was completely disproportional, and Al-Qaeda was never a threat to the West.
It's pretty crazy, hey. They got
the
fucked.
idea that, so particularly if you were in the United States at the time of 9/11, and even more so if you were in New York, if you know someone who died in the attacks, or if you're in Washington, because they flew a plane into the Pentagon as well, then the events of 9/11, I'm sure, would have been extremely traumatic. But
yeah,
in terms of, was it a civilizational threat? No. Like,
absolutely not.
Not at all. Like, the US is wealthier than it was before 9/11. It, like, with the Iraq War and things like that, I think George W. Bush really fucked up American soft power around the world. But, like, it just was not a civilizational threat. And I just can't imagine a world in which Osama bin Laden defeated the United States of America. It's pure fantasy. So,
technically somewhere in the multiverse that happened.
Yeah.
Just the proportion of multiverses in which that happened is vanishingly small.
Yeah, he says, so in Among a Band of Knights, published February 2003, he says, we can conclude that America is a superpower with enormous military strength and vast economic power, but that all is built on the foundations of straw. So it is possible to target these foundations and focus on their weakest points, which, even if you strike only 1/10 of them, then the whole edifice will totter and sway and relinquish its unjust leadership of the world. So I would say a lot of American wealth is built on pretty dubious things, like the American dollar is an article of faith, but it's an article
One
of
of
faith
which is
backed
the US
up
dollar.
by a huge army and nukes, which like that is a physical backing.
Yeah, it's a lot of backing.
Massively, massively indebted. But
Proof
at the
of
same
work.
time,
What about proof of warship?
proof of
How's
war?
that?
I think proof of worship is actually
Take
a
that,
reasonable
Satoshi.
strategy of maintaining a currency.
Satoshi could actually afford to buy warships,
works.
though. I recently
But-
saw that a $13 billion US warship was finished. Like the construction of it was finished recently.
fucking
$13
money.
billion is like 1,200 meters long or something. It could carry like X number of fucking planes and all this sort of shit. I was like, that is fucking crazy. Like, just unbelievable. They dropped $13 billion on a fucking warship. And
Yep.
just like this one ship could take out like basically any other fucking country's navy.
Yeah. I mean, we'll have to see what happens in the next episode of ChatGPT Storytime if Xi Jinping could single-handedly take it on. Just swims out to sea
No, I'm
like a
I'm
shark,
gonna-
bites a hole in its hull, chews through it.
I'm going to guess that I'm going to side with you. It was disproportional.
Yeah, so things like, so in the case of the United States, the Patriot Act, Australia jumped on the bandwagon. The
Yeah, it's
government
bad.
quite happily, and this was I'm glad that the Labor Party and the coalition in Australia could find some bipartisan ground to oppress their own citizens in passing laws legalizing indefinite detention without trial.
And keep in mind that this affected,
Legalizing spying on their own citizens' communications, making telecommunications providers keep records of messages sent between Australians, shit like that. And Australia doesn't have a Bill of Rights, so all of that's absolutely A-OK legally. All of that was fucking bullshit. Continues to be bullshit because it's still legal and still on the books, and no politician in Australia will talk about it because they all love it, because it's just an expansion of their own arbitrary power. Like, that sort of stuff was way, way disproportional to the threat of Al-Qaeda or of Islamic extremism.
Yeah, it seems as though the expansion of state power, specifically to control and coerce its own people, is something that is always so easily advocated for by our parliamentarians, but is never regressed. So it's like, it's a ratchet. It clicks into place and it just keeps on getting tighter.
Yeah, you can always say there is another terrorist threat, or it always
Or there's
exists
another
as
virus.
a potential. It's like, well, we need to keep these laws on the books because what if?
The biosecurity state has clamped down. We've got a friend, which we will not name, and we cannot name, who may or may not run a blog about
Called
about the effects of the fiat control system on our health. And he may or may not be a Bitcoin maximalist. Can't say. But suffice to say, like that was one of the most, probably what did more damage to the West than the actual terrorism was the state's response to terrorism and the destruction of our civil liberties in the West. And in Australia, keep in mind, in Australia, we actually do have constitutional freedom of religion. We don't have constitutional freedom of speech and other things, but we have constitutional freedom of religion. And that means that, like, in the entire premise of, like, using the surveillance capitalism to target a particular, like religious minority or something like that is expressly, like, against the Constitution. So the only way you could spin that sort of thing is, like, you can't say it's against Muslims. You can only say it's against like, okay, Islamic radicalists or something like that. But in effect, it can be used against everybody. Like it's not they didn't tailor the laws to only be able to target like this sort of person, that sort of person.
No, the laws are intentionally vaguely defined and can be applied to anyone who is inconvenient.
What is that scope creep? The scope creep, or the definitional like expansion of what is terror, what is terrorist activity, what can be construed as such, or might be a threat. And remember, like state technology, military technology, like they don't just use that for the military; they use that for the police force. Like in Australia, we've got these things in the New South Wales called the Raptor Squad, which ostensibly
Raptor Squad.
Yeah, it's a crazy name.
Fucking Jurassic Park Squad. Yeah, nice.
Ostensibly, they're only supposed to be used against like big fucking busts, you know, like I don't know, like cartels or bikies or whatever. They pull that shit out at fucking house parties. And these are like big fucking dudes built like brick shit houses, like armed to the fucking teeth, you know, SWAT gear and all that sort of garbage. And they'll throw that at house parties. You know, it's disgusting. It's fucking disgusting. The militarization of the police since the early 2000s has been one of the worst things that has happened in the West.
Yeah. And I would say Osama, I don't think he is responsible for that happening. So before 9/11, he said that he supported attacks on the West to get the West out of the Middle East. After 9/11, when he finally claimed responsibility for 9/11, which did take a few years for him to come out and say it, by that stage, it was clear that his initial goal fell through, that 9/11 made the West more involved in the Middle East. So he turned around and started saying, oh, I did it to bleed the West dry in a long war, or a series of long wars in the Middle East, as well as make Western governments reveal to the world that their talk and supposed veneration of liberty and freedom and things like that is just a total sham. I would say that to an extent, governments or any large organizations will always act to increase their own power. It's just an internal logic of organizations, that organizations will have some sort of objective that they were formed to fulfill.
Yeah,
and
issues around like,
and they're just, it's fairly logical that they will seek to accumulate power to further achieve that goal, because just the more power they have, the more capable they are of achieving a goal. In which case, like governments, I don't think governments are strictly antithetical to freedom. I'm far from someone who will argue for no state. But
no, me neither.
Certainly there is, you know, an amount
too much state
of interference past which, they do just start destroying
also
individual
all of the
liberties.
atrocities, like the big scale atrocities, have all been committed by nation states or empires.
In which case, I think Osama bin Laden saying that, and again, this is just him not understanding free societies, him saying that the governments of free societies demonstrate that the governments of free societies don't necessarily support freedom and personal liberty to the same extent that maybe an individual citizen would support it. Therefore, those values are a sham. Like, he doesn't distinguish between an individual citizen and a government.
Yeah.
As well as that, just the claim that he was playing 4D chess and he all along wanted to make Western governments overreact and clamp down on civil liberties at home, I think is a bit of a stretch and a post hoc rationalization of a fuck up. And then I would also say that I don't think Osama bin Laden inspired governments to expand their power beyond what I think it should be in terms of
I don't think
detention without trial, and mass surveillance and things like that. I think he gave them an excuse. I think if it weren't for him, something else would have come up.
Yeah, for sure.
I think people have a few times asked what our actual political views are, and we've never said them outright, but I do think the past few minutes have given people...
Well, I didn't say expressly what my views were, but I said I had criticisms of things. So I feel like I haven't said what they are, but I have certainly said what they are not.
I'm an anarcho-monarchist.
Anarcho-crypto-monarchist.
Anarcho-monarchist. I want no state except for a divine ruler.
And crypto and Bitcoin.
And,
Like
Satoshi Nakamoto is the divine ruler.
And anybody who's like the reincarnation of
the on-chain reincarnation of Satoshi
Max Kaiser,
Nakamoto.
that fucking crazy son of a bitch, is the reincarnation of Satoshi.
No, I want the Bitcoin blockchain to exist as the spirit of Satoshi Nakamoto, and we need to look for answers within the blockchain. We need how in Rome,
could you imagine doing numerology on the
in
blockchain,
divination,
dude?
like looking at entrails or how the crows flew over the Palatine Hill. We need a group of people to divine the movements of the Bitcoin blockchain, to interpret in them the messages from our Lord Satoshi, and that is how we will rule society. I want as much blockchain mysticism as possible.
Blockchain mysticism. Do you reckon there might actually be something on the internet that's got like blockchain mysticism? What do you reckon?
I think blockchain mysticism is fertile ground. And if it doesn't exist yet, then we should start it. A spirituality based on tea leaf reading of the blockchain.
It's literally designed to just be complete scramble. And you're just reading meaning into like the different like hash outputs and shit.
I don't care about signal. I just want noise. I just want the noise in the blockchain. Like those Rorschach ink blot tests.
So I had another point down here that we can discuss, which is the state of the world now, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So some of them could be like, for example, was the war on terror a distraction from other more important things, such as the rise of China, the CCP in particular?
Yeah, I think probably. So there are a few things. So American and all Western countries need a source of hydrocarbon power, or of power, but at the moment, the backbone of all of our energy grids is hydrocarbon.
Yeah.
And like there needs to be a minimum level of stability in the Middle East for America to get good access.
The Middle East has really high quality oil. Like, even though other countries have like different sources, like fracking was a big thing for the US over the last 15 years, still just like the quality of the oil out of Saudi Arabia is insane.
Yeah, and people like Peter Zeihan say that America is pulling back from the Middle East in part because of the fracking industry means that the United States has much more of a domestic production capacity for hydrocarbons.
Their breakthroughs have actually been throttled by the environmentalist movement in the US by shutting down research and deployment of fracking. They could have actually scaled it up even faster. Which, obviously people who are environmentalists might say that was the right thing, but one of the effects is that domestic supply of oil means that they need to get it from elsewhere.
Yeah, environmentalists will also tend to start screaming for the government to do something as soon as electricity bills get too high.
Yeah, well, the Labor government is bringing in price controls, or at least debating price controls for the energy market here, which is
that's not going to blow up in their faces.
Fucking morons learn. Hey, all they've got to read
it's like we've tried this before. This is not a new idea, and it just keeps not working.
It's been tried for quite a while, and it never works, and we know why it doesn't work. Yeah, these fucking
all
morons.
It does is, I'm going to use a technical term here. It fucks the shit out of price signals, and things collapse eventually.
But I feel like we're giving away too much of our potential political opinion.
Well, I've already stated I didn't say very, very explicitly that I am an anarcho-monarchist. So I don't know how much more clear I can be.
Again, I'm going to emphasize that I didn't say what my political opinion was. I just said
anarcho-monarchy as well.
It was not price controls for the energy market. Dumb idea. But also, who cares? Let's just accelerate it into the ground, hey?
Mike Ma accelerationism.
What about well, with the distraction from China and other stuff, like, what do you is there? Is this going to be too vague a question, or is it? Can I actually ask anyway? Why was the war on terror such an enormous issue relative to the size of like the actual threat versus like the China thing was not only ignored, but like the West actively, maybe on understandable grounds, like trade relations, in the hope that like China was opening up, but it has just like gone in such the opposite direction in the last like 5 to 10 years, that you would think that the rise of China would be perceived as an enormous geopolitical threat. But in fact, it was like these two issues were precisely out of tilt between like the actual size of the threat versus like the amount of attention and scrutiny it received.
Yeah,
and resourcing.
Yeah, that's such an understatement.
Yeah, it's just insane.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think there was, so this is massively multifactorial, and I guess I'll just be thinking out loud. There was quite a bit of
we're totally unqualified
drinking.
to be talking about this stuff, Jack.
No,
It's just bullshitting.
I'm the world's best geostrategic analyst, as everybody knows. That's why people listen to this podcast, to hear me talk about this sort of stuff. I know everything.
Sorry, I'm putting Vicks up my nose.
There's nothing I don't know.
I'm not putting anything else up my nose. Anything bad up my nose. I'm putting Vicks to clear my nose because I've got a blocked nose.
Levi's
I'm not
just
snorting
huffing
drugs.
a line of speed, just
sorry. On a Sunday
hoovering
night
it up
before
as
going to work.
schnoz.
Schnozzing,
So
just a mixture
he
of
can
ketamine
answer
and
this
cocaine.
question really, really excited.
Stay up until stand up in the morning. I can stay awake until 9:30 a.m. tomorrow morning to go to stand up.
No, in part, there was, I think, with the end of the Cold War, there was this period of triumphalism that, yep, the West has come up with the final political system. So Francis Fukuyama's The End of History is frequently mischaracterized as just a triumphalist tract talking about how the West has worked out everything and how there is not going to be a political... There won't be any more iterations of political thought now that liberal democracy has prevailed over the Soviet Union.
That's silly.
But
who is this person?
That caricature was fairly widespread in the West. So I think there was a degree of that in terms of not seeing a rising China as a threat. So seeing that, okay, as the Chinese middle class grows, as it grows wealthier, then naturally they will become liberal Democrats because that is the direction of history. And this idea of a directional history, I think, is pretty frivolous. As well as that, I wonder whether it was just a feeling of not having an enemy. So the Soviet Union fell. You had the 90s where it was great, where America just got to do whatever the fuck it wanted. And then suddenly in 2001, there was a feeling of vulnerability again because there were this series of attacks within the United States, very, very high profile, very public, where thousands of people died. And it was suddenly the return of vulnerability. And I wonder whether people overreacted because of that.
Yeah, I think that would be a big part of it. I also think the fact that there were successful attacks on US soil was a big part of it as well.
Yeah.
And there's no, in terms of the optics, there's no like warning with an attack like 9/11. If you're going to go to war, say with Japan, like, it's the military, there's going to be a naval front, and the citizens themselves are not like at the front line. Whereas like in terms of optics and propaganda, the 2001 attacks were just so successful because it like just brought it straight into civilian life on US soil.
Yeah.
So I think from a kind of psychological propaganda point of view is like a masterpiece.
Yeah. And then almost, or at least to my mind, one of the worst outcomes of that has eventuated in that now, so the threat of Al-Qaeda has receded, the threat of ISIS, lone wolf attacks,
It
seems to have receded.
It's like every 5 years they need a new Muslim organization that is some sort of threat to Western civilization.
Yeah, but also Western populations have just grown accustomed to a war on terror world where when we go to the airport now, we just assume that we're going to be fucking irradiated in useless security screening mechanisms. We assume that we'll be treated like cattle who all have the potential to be carrying a bomb and a Kalashnikov and are just waiting to be carrying out a mass casualty attack. We expect that all our communications are going to be monitored, and you're going to be under suspicion if you dare use something like Signal or, before Tor was compromised, if you're using a VPN and Tor. You just assume that police have powers to arbitrarily detain you without charge or without telling you why. And in Australia, if you talk about your arbitrary detention, then you can go to prison. We've just grown used to this and accept that this is the way the world works, which is one of the worst outcomes, I think, of the war on terror that could have happened.
Spurned authoritarianism in the West, which is really the most damaging thing that these the war on terror, these attacks helped precipitate was, and it's bipartisan. This is a criticism. What Jack and I are saying, I guess, at the moment is can be framed against essentially all major parties.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they are all not merely complicit, like they've actively been like making the policies and legislation to basically expand police power, state power, domestic homeland security power, and the rise of that authoritarian machine has been. Oh, it's been terrible for the West. I am so acutely aware of how authoritarian Australia. Well, I feel, in my assessment, how authoritarian Australia is, and I don't like it. That's part of the reason why I need to go and spend some time away from Australia.
In the case of Australia, it's this strange, suspended, minimally invasive authoritarianism because moment to moment, it's not. It's not like you're living in North Korea or something like that. Like, you can openly criticize the Australian government, which is exactly what we're doing right now. It's not that. It's more the government is basically has given itself a loaded gun, and you are relying on the goodwill of people in Canberra, which is a fucking stupid course of action.
They're
not
renowned
to use it.
For their integrity.
So basically, like they have the ability
to
just detain people without giving a reason why. They have the ability to monitor your communications. You're just hoping that because of convention, that Australia hasn't conventionally been authoritarian in this way, that they don't do it. But it's that potential that disturbs
have become more authoritarian, and now it's just a matter of hoping that the people in seats of power within those institutions don't become malicious with that power, or don't become more malicious with that power. Yeah, it's an incredibly dangerous and precarious position to be in. I don't think most Australians give two thoughts to it.
No, probably not. And because we don't have a Bill of Rights, it's even more.
Yeah.
That danger is even greater. So I wouldn't say Australia is authoritarian at the moment, but the concept of authoritarianism is slippery, and I think by certain definitions you can say it is. I just think those definitions are probably a bit permissive, but it is. It has the legal possibility of becoming quite authoritarian, and again, within the legal framework that already exists in Australia, it could become quite authoritarian. And that's, I think, one of the most lasting pieces of damage from the war on terror.
It's still better than obviously other countries in this regard, but the way that I think about it is that there's the category and then there's the spectrum or the subcategories, and there are aspects of Australia that just categorically are authoritarian, but like with regards to like the spectrum of or the multiplicity of forms that authoritarianism can take, it is one of the lesser forms. A good example is my current understanding of the Australian education system is that it is illegal not to send your child to school, or if you're delivering homeschooling, illegal not to conform to the Australian curriculum standards, which a lot of people, I think, like in my social context, would be like, that's a good thing, isn't it? But what they don't realize is that essentially that's saying that an authority, the Australian Curriculum Board, can set what is the knowledge and the standard of knowledge in our entire like primary and secondary education system that must be conformed to by all like hundreds of thousands of children. And if you don't, you can have criminal charges and like be in like up for, say, like in front of child protective services and stuff. And that is not as bad as like, say, the indoctrination of North Koreans. Obviously, these are different parts of the spectrum, and I know that it's a lot better here in Australia. But in terms of categorically, well, if the government is saying you must teach your kids a certain prescribed curriculum and not doing so will get you in legal trouble, that is just categorically authoritarian. And whether or not it gets worse or better is a matter of like, do people even appreciate that that's authoritarian, and that in principle is not, well, in my perspective, like I don't find it acceptable.
Yeah, that's
somebody else thousands
if
of
that's
kilometers
defined
away
as authoritarianism, then not all forms, or at least not all degrees of authoritarianism, I disagree with. I think there are actually, it's a good thing to have minimum educational standards. My concern then would be more, how do you define those educational standards? My concern is less that there is an authority saying that you have to adhere to certain standards.
Yeah. Oh, I guess we disagree on that then. I think if somebody doesn't want to send their kids to school, then they don't have to. I mean, I don't know if that's a good idea, but whether or not they are mandated to, I think is a violation of their rights as people and as parents.
Yeah, I guess that's a point of disagreement, but also, I was about to say not relevant to Osama bin Laden, then realised that at least half of this podcast has been completely off topic. I don't think this is even unusually off topic for us by our standards.
Maybe I'm talking too much about my own politics. I've got to shut the fuck up. Talk more about OBL. Are there any other interesting points? Maybe you should cut that entire part out and just like remove my
No, keep it in. I think there's no end to sort of interesting stuff to talk about with respect to Osama bin Laden. Like, I've got 15,500 words of quotes here. It's just, I think we've covered most of the interesting parts, and yes, we could offer additional detail on his religiosity or his view of Israel and things like that. But I think in the interests of brevity, which is one of our strengths, we're very good at offering terse, brief, to-the-point commentaries on a variety of authors and systems of thought. In the interests of brevity, it probably actually wouldn't add much more.
I don't see any other worthwhile. The only other question we have is what would the world be like if the West had not intervened in the Middle East in the different various, but particularly since the 80s. I don't know is that worth answering? I don't know.
That's crystal ball gazing. That's probably even beyond my prodigious abilities at imagining alternate histories.
Well, are there any other interesting talking points?
How do I sign up to Al Qaeda 2? Al Qaeda 2.0.
All right. Well, then, any concluding thoughts about OBL?
Look, I'm happy actually that I read something that the things that he wrote and transcripts of things that he said, because for a figure who has featured so prominently in our public discourse, there is actually very little discussion of his own words. You only ever really hear about people talking about him. So it is, I think it is useful to go to a primary source. I would recommend that people read at least one of his writings. Probably his, it's called like To the People of America or something like that. That's probably the most useful one because it sums up his beliefs, his demands of the West, and also offers a fairly good view of his argumentative techniques and his approach to persuasion. I wouldn't bother reading this whole book because it's very repetitive.
No, I think like getting it, maybe just pick out the interesting sounding ones. Oh, at the beginning of each essay or whatever, there's a short introduction giving context. So if you were to buy this book, which I would also recommend buying, it is interesting.
I'd recommend the book actually. It's a good book.
Yeah, and it's not. So I got the paperback. It's really nice. It's a nice book. Flick through it, pick out some interesting ones to read. It is really interesting to read his perspective, and also don't take, obviously, like, this might be one of the first. Oh no, we recommended Mike Marr, but it's not very often that we actually recommend reading the books. And and in this particular case, if you were like, don't take our word for everything that we just said. You can read for it yourself. Like, the guy's a complete religious like nutcase and can't think outside his tiny little world, and I don't think any of the stuff that was said about him this evening is like even remotely unfair. So yeah.
No, earlier I said I wanted him to fuck me in the mouth. I think that's probably unfair.
That's not unfair. Sounds like a really good time. I want him to sodomize the shit out of me. Come on, Osama.
I want him to shove his fist up my ass, just cram it in there without lube.
Osama. What an impressive mark this person has left on history for, really having, in a weird way, having achieved nothing. Having achieved nothing except for like provoking an unbelievably powerful enemy. But
I would say one thing that he did give me was when he was killed, I was living with quite a few Americans, and they threw a huge party to celebrate Osama getting killed. And I remember like, it was a really fun party. And even then, 18-year-old Jack was sort of disturbed at just
throwing a party
mirth at some guy whom none of us had ever met getting shot dead in his home in Pakistan.
Yeah,
so he gave me a very strange experience while I was living overseas.
Wouldn't have gone to an
I'll
Osama
give him
assassination party
as praise.
myself.
Thanks, Osama, for a very strange night celebrating your death with a group of Americans.
I think there's got to be a line somewhere. Like, maybe I can understand partying because you killed, say, Hitler or Stalin or something like that. But you know what? Like the other year when Thatcher died, there were like people even in Melbourne who were like partying. There were people who like threw Thatcher celebration death parties, and
I found it pretty fucking weird when Melbourne, like
really
champagne socialists at the University of Melbourne, were celebrating Thatcher's death. It's like, mate, you're 19. Like, did this have any impact on you? You don't even live in the right country.
I found it, yeah.
Anyway,
I found it quite distasteful, and probably wouldn't celebrate Osama's death either. But then again, I'm non-American, so. But I would have actually thought that, I don't think any. I would imagine that celebrating people's death is not allowed in Islam. But I would actually have thought that Muslims would have had more reason to celebrate his death than Americans.
Well, as we know, as the indisputable scholar Osama bin Laden has said, or at least intimated, if you disagree with him, you're not a Muslim.
The oldest trick in the book, hey?
Identify yourself with the faith.
Good on him. Fucking good on him. Honest bloke.
Next episode. I think the next episode will be one with Ed, or the next one to be released. We just watched Wolf Warrior 2, the Chinese propaganda action movie, and I got to say, it was pretty good. It's a very entertaining movie.
Best movie
especially the racial dimension of it. They haven't quite ironed out all of the kinks in terms of coming out with a truly global propaganda phenomenon. There is a lot of
It's that bad,
Han
is it?
Chinese racial supremacy at work there, which I found very funny, but I don't know if it will go down well, particularly in Africa. I won't say more about it
They fucked
until
up,
it's time to
didn't
record the episode.
All right.
You can watch it for free on YouTube, though, which I did. I mean, I paid for it.
You fucking paid for it. Oh my god, Jack.
So please, Xi Jinping, don't drone strike my house because I illegally watched Wolf Warrior 2 with English dubs on YouTube in like 360p blurry Nokia quality.
The English subs are the best. So bad.
Oh, they're so good. Anyway, thanks for listening.